Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rachel Rees toku ingoa, ko Roti Koro mātua whakatū. Nā mahari mai, welcome back to our future development strategy deliberations meetings. We're on our second day, and we'll start today with karakia, and I'll invite one of the panel members or the staff to lead karakia today. Release. I'm happy, or if you like, I can open with karakia. I'm happy to open. Kia hura te marino, kia whakapapa po nāmu te moana, aroho atu, aroho mai, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, welcome. So let us go forth today, and as the sun shines like the greenstone and goodwill has been exchanged, and I acknowledge all of you have come together today for our hui. So kia ora, welcome. Tēnā koe, Aina.
Kia ora koutou katoa.
Kia ora. We finished yesterday panel we've made some good progress, I think. We're working our way through the different sections that we need to cover off that the officers have set out for us. We were at the point of considering whether we want to resolve some more of the clauses, but I think the useful thing for starting today is probably just to come to the officers, because you've circulated some additional information overnight, and in particular we've got Drew's updated emissions information, and perhaps we want to have a look at that before we move on to the other matters. Would that be a good start for today?
Yeah, I think so, Mayor. Yeah, Drew's actually only available for the first hour today anyway, so it might be a good idea to do that first. Yep.
Kia ora, Drew. It's nice to have you here in person. All right, so we start with that item, and you're happy to introduce your supplementary material that you sent to us last night.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Through the chair. Attachment number 5 is a memo that I wrote regarding greenhouse gas emissions, transport-related greenhouse gas emissions, to take into account the different development scenarios. So going back a little bit in history, when we started to go down this track, I started to get a feeling that that we needed to actually look at the greenhouse gas emissions from transportation from different settlement patterns. And so I started to look into that. I used census data from 2018, the travel to work and school census data, and I undertook a way of trying to understand the different settlement areas and what greenhouse gas emissions that we were going to get from that, or at least comparatively. And I have created a VKTs, or vehicle kilometres travelled, analysis based on those development patterns. So that is figure 1 in the supplementary information that you received last night. From that, you can see that by and large the areas that are much further away from the Nelson-Richmond area tend to have a greater number of VKTs and hence greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas those that are much closer have a lot less, and in many cases even half to a third of what some of the further distances were. It's interesting to note in figure 1 that rural residential areas like Pigeon Valley, Falcon Ridge and Mitten Heights have some of the highest vehicle kilometres travelled, and that sort of makes sense, is because they don't have a local input. People aren't working within the communities that they're living. The exception to this is Motueka. Motueka has, it does, even though it is quite some distance, in fact one of the furthest distance from Nelson Richmond, it in itself has a number of industries, workplaces and a high school. And because of that, a large number of people stay local. And indeed, those that do go out, a majority of those that leave Motueka go to relatively close areas around Motueka, such as Kaitiritiri or Lower Moutere. And that's reflected in the vehicle kilometres travelled that you see in figure 1. Taking that information, I've then brought it through and tried to model what the greenhouse gas emissions from the different from the future development proposal will be, and that's in figure 2, and it's the orange line that I'm referring to. You can see there that we are starting off combined Nelson Tasman. The transport emissions are around 240,000 tonnes. That's household transport emissions, 240,000 tonnes per year. And what I've done is I've taken into account the emissions reduction plan that came out 2 weeks ago, but also some guidance from Ministry of Transport around what transport's going to be like in the future. So, for example, the emissions reduction plan indicates that we're trying to achieve 30% of our fleet, or of our light vehicle fleet, being electric vehicle by 2035, and the Ministry of Transport indicates that 97% of our light vehicle fleet will be electric by 2050. So that's some of the information that I've used in there. I've also taken into account the goals that we've got within the regional land transport plan, which is combined between Nelson Tasman and Marlborough, with walking and cycling, but also the changes that we've got in our regional public transport plan, again, Nelson Tasman, to kind of come up with what the transport related emissions will be. Now, to put that in context, I created 2 different scenarios. One is intensification. So this is just creating, catering for all living within the Nelson Richmond area only. And then I've done another scenario, which is a rural development somewhere out, to kind of give it an envelope and to kind of understand where the future development strategy proposal fits within those 2 kind of extremes. And as you can see in figure 2, it actually sits fairly close to the intensification area. So in other words, it's pretty good in terms of where it could be. Figure 3 of the supplementary information then takes a step further and just indicates that if we are following the advice to try and keep greenhouse gas emissions or global greenhouse gas emissions less than keep greenhouse gas emissions low to stop temperature increases more than 1.5 degrees Celsius, then the targets are 50% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And so that's the yellow line on in figure 3. And as you can see, despite being the future development strategy proposal, despite it being well situated within the 2 extremes of what we can do in our district, it's still quite some distance away from the goals that we're getting to try and achieve that less than 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature or temperature rise. I've then also just more recently, and this is figure 4, gone on to try and do a few more scenario tests to see if there's things that we could do to try and get it closer to that target. And the first one, and it's that I did, and it's marked purple. It's actually really hard to read, and I'll explain why in a minute. Is if we reduced our growth rate from the high growth that we've assumed down to a medium. In other words, we don't get the amount that we predicted. You can see that just the sheer number of people coming to the district that's included in the future development strategy does make a significant difference. Likewise, I did another test scenario where we actually stage our future development strategy. So I'm taking the same proposal, but I'm actually staging it so that we look at the areas around Richmond, Nelson first, before we go to some of the outlying areas. And you can see also that makes a significant difference as well. It gets it closer. And this is why it's hard to read, is that the green line, which is the staged approach, and the purple line, which is the median growth rate, give or take about the same trend, so the lines end up being on top of each other. The reason we put a supplementary in is that we now have taken into account the emissions reduction plan, which we didn't have when I did the first version of this, or version 2 of this. And we've also now taken into account some of the different settlement patterns that that staff are recommending as part of the report. If I go back up in the supplementary information to table 1, it just gives you a table that shows you the differences between what we presented in the workshop and what we're presenting now. There is small differences, there's minor differences, but the biggest difference is in the 2035 area. And that's mostly around the change in advice between Ministry of Transport and the emissions reduction plan, which went from the Ministry of Transport recommended 27% of the fleet would be electric by 2035, whereas the emissions reduction plan have now increased that to 30%. Hopefully I've kind of bamboozled you with a lot of figures and numbers. I hope that makes sense. More than happy to take questions on that.
Drew, thank you very much. Look, you haven't bamboozled us. It's extremely well put together in the report, and having you run through it today has been excellent. So thank you. I'll open for questions. Go to Councillor Ika.
So just to clarify, table 2, this is based on the national targets. And so versus anything we're doing locally with our changes in public transport, or is that also, I mean, because are there differences between the two?
So through the chair, there is some slight differences between the two, between what we're doing locally and what has been advised nationally. The Ministry of Transport information came out over a year ago now, and because of that, both councils, and it was signalled well ahead of that as well, so both councils have been able to use those in formulating their own plans. So the regional land transport plan and the regional public transport plan by and large fall in line with what we're recommending here. So it's I'm using our numbers, but they are very similar to what national guidance has been.
Thank you. And just follow-up question, do we anticipate increased active transport playing a role in reductions in VKTs or GHGs?
Yeah, through the chair, certainly we do, and that's the assumption that I've made in this model, is that where we have we've had increased walking and cycling, and that takes a proportion of the VKTs and hence the overall greenhouse gas emissions. And we have used, I've used a bit of an amalgam of what is being talked about here and the change in VKTs that you see in column number 2 of table 2, and what Tasman has got in its walk and cycling strategy that was adopted last week. I know that Nelson doesn't have a walk and cycling strategy, or a recent one at least. So that's why I've used a bit of an amalgam of what national guidelines are and what Tasman's indicated.
Thank you. And then just finally, so the increase in active transport, is that just within the, I guess, within the FDS, draft FDS, you know, we've tried to make sure that there's employment sites near any population growth. But does that also take into account that we're hoping, you know, even if someone does live in Brightwater and continues working in Richmond, for example, you know, enhanced active transport networks will just mean they're more likely to cycle anyway, even if there isn't now employment for them in Brightwater, as an example.
So through the chair, with the outlying settlements, we've taken a proportion of the local journeys, a high proportion of the local journeys will be undertaken by active transport. And that's believable because most of the small settlements are small enough that that's a doable thing. I've also taken a very much smaller proportion will travel to another township or into a larger urban area, but it's a fraction of what the local journeys will be. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Councillor McGurk.
Thanks, through you, Madam Chair. A couple of questions for me. Thanks, Drew. I read this last night. It was fascinating. Now, a couple of things you could just help me explain any variation between the population settlements in the area that we're talking about. You know, are there any variations that you've taken into account in terms of local journeys or journeys outside? You talked about to start off with a high proportion of travel to work and school in the urban area, but within the area we're talking about, are there any variations we can take about? As you're talking about, Mapua is different from Wakefield, but just explain that.
Yeah, so through the chair, when you look at figure 1, for example, you can take two different townships, and Wakefield and Mapua is a really good example of this. Wakefield and Mapua, by and large, have a similar population. They are a similar distance away from Richmond, and they also have similar aspects, like they have a 4 square, they have a primary school. So they've got quite a lot in common. There is, however, through the census data, some really interesting differentiations in travel patterns. So Mapua, for example, 50% that travel to work or school stay within Mapua. Wakefield, in comparison, only 30% that travel for work and school stay within Wakefield. So some of our towns do operate slightly different from other towns, even though they are very similar. And sorry, just to clarify, that is travel to work and school, so it does take out of the equation any influences that may come from a higher proportion of people that are retired.
Right. So in terms of influencing some of the decisions we're going to make for our future development study, what's the advice is that concentrating on the existing settlements?
Through the chair, I mean, what I've done is I have tried to model the future development strategy proposal. I haven't tried to assume anything like that, but what I have done is given some scenario testing, and obviously in the scenario testing, proximity to the Nelson Richmond area does improve greenhouse gas emissions.
Through the Mayor, could I just maybe clarify that question as well? So even though Drew's provided us with some revised analysis, the recommendations in the officer's report at paragraph 11.26 and 11.27 do remain. So what we're proposing is recommending the core part of the proposal. That's where we're consolidating growth largely along State Highway 6, but also including Mapua, Motueka and Tasman rural towns. What we've said in the report here is that although the FDS proposal itself doesn't meet the emission reduction target, neither does the intensification only target, which Drew's just gone through. Sorry, yeah, I might just be crossing over a bit, but I'll just go through this. Is that all right if I carry on? Or? Yeah. Even though that assumes a high uptake rate, what we've stressed is that the FDS has modelled a high growth scenario, and that may not eventuate. We may end up with medium growth only, who knows, in which case we wouldn't need as many of these sites. And we've recommended the implementation plan, looking at, reviewed population projections, housing demand and uptake and intensification, and using the sort of servicing of land and rezoning of land as the control method for releasing greenfield sites in a controlled way to try and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, okay, just looking at, sort of you do the various models, and each of them sort of is just, you've got the target, and each of these we sort of just fall just short, but that's 30 years away. So how certain, well, what sort of certainty can you give to sort of that sort of target so far out? If the settlement patterns go the way that's sort of anticipated, what's the variability?
Yeah, so through the chair, I probably can't provide any degree of certainty, I'm sorry, because there is a lot of variables in this. Look, we've made assumptions on the uptake of public transport, which we might not realise. It could go the other way, that we actually have more uptake in public transport. Probably the biggest one that has the biggest, sorry, there's two that probably have the biggest influence on this, and I have sort of tweaked them just to understand how much variability you get out of it. But one is population. So if we don't have high growth, in fact, if we have low growth, that makes a significant difference, and we can make a significant impact on our greenhouse gas emissions just because we're not growing as much. That stands to reason. The other one is that the emissions reduction plan does indicate, and the Ministry of Transport do indicate, that they're expecting to see 30% of the light vehicle fleet be electric by 2030 and 97% by 2050. That the electrification of their vehicle fleet has a significant effect on this. So yeah, if we don't realise those numbers, or indeed if we actually get more than we anticipated, then that will make a significant difference, because it's not just impacting new residents to our area and new dwellings, but it's also impacting existing residents. Yeah.
Councillor Maynham.
Drew, just in terms of the population, if we have a bigger percentage of retired people, does that impact it significantly, or is it more just a straight population?
So through the chair, it does impact it. I mean, I haven't analysed this to a high degree. So I'm going to make some assumptions here. I would assume that they don't, retired people don't travel as often, but the places that they do travel are in line with the places that people that aren't retired travel. So in other words, and that's what I've used here, is I've used the basis of people going to work and school as the locations that are most common that anyone travels to. So in other words, I'll take the Mapua example again. If 50% of all journeys are to Richmond and Nelson, then a retired person will do 50% of their stuff locally and probably 50% outside of town.
Councillor Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a couple of questions, Drew, from myself. Just in relation to other key assumptions you've included is, and I'll just read it for you to refresh your memory. Growth of existing settlements or suburbs will mean a greater portion of residents will stay within the settlement for work. How certain are you that that will happen? Because that hasn't currently been the trend, has it? Particularly in relation to Wakefield.
So through the chair, look, where we've got, so within Tasman district, we've got different townships of different sizes. And certainly where we have a greater population, we have a greater number of people staying locally. And I'm going to, again, go back to the Mapua example, 2,000 people, population is around 2,000, and we have about 50% of the population staying locally. And you go to Motueka, where the population is around 8,000, and you have what was it, 70% staying locally. And then you even get to Richmond, which has a population of around 16,000, and you have 80-something%. I'm sorry, I've forgotten, the numbers don't come to mind. So the larger towns that you get, the more stay locally. That is probably impacted quite greatly by when you get a larger settlement, or you do end up triggering things like high schools, and high schools seem to have quite a variability on this as well. So if a town like Wakefield, for example, grew to the same size as Motueka, it's likely to have a high school, so you're likely to have more people staying locally there as well. So that's the basis of that assumption.
So that what you're really saying is the size creates more employment just by the mere fact of the size of the population and the demographic, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
And so like Wakefield currently is probably transitioning it, and if all the houses that we talked about happen, or some of the things you've just talked about will happen as well.
That is correct. And indeed, what I've done is I've staged it. So if there was a small increase in population, then I've kept the local, as in the journeys locally, as a minor amount. But if development, the future development strategy included not only growth in residents but growth in commercial, then I've kept a what I've called local journeys. If the development has not only a population increase, but a housing increase, but a commercial increase, then there will be a greater number of journeys that are made locally.
Okay, thanks. That probably leads well onto my next round, which is a slightly different subject than earlier in the presentation. You talked about rural residential using far more or creating far more emissions than residential. I just want to explore that a little bit. What is the reasoning behind that? Because quite often they're part of the same communities and quite close to them. So what's the driver that rural residential cause more emissions?
So through the chair, if you have a rural residential that's close to an existing settlement, all those, as compared to a development within a settlement, all of the journeys that within the settlement could be done by walking and cycling, whereas if a rural residential is outside of a settlement and indeed some distance away, they're less likely to walk and cycle for those local journeys. They're having to drive for those as well as the journeys that they make much further on.
Right, okay. So, yeah, no, I think that's all for now.
Councillor Ogilvie.
Can I just follow up on that question from Stuart? What distinction, therefore, have you made between, say, Falcon Rise as one rural residential area and the 2 or 3 at Mitten Heights and around the Waiwhero? Because there's a difference in distance to Wakefield compared to the distance from those 3 to Motueka.
So through the chair, when rural residential was a little bit more tricky to model, partly because with the existing townships, I could find out how many journeys were made locally. But with rural residential, because there is no residential area there already, I didn't have data to rely on. So I relied on the local township to give me that data. So for the likes of Falcon Ridge, what I did was I said that the journeys that are undertaken locally in Brightwater are likely to be undertaken by people that would live in Falcon Ridge, except they'll be driving from Falcon Ridge to Brightwater. And so there wouldn't be the same number of journeys by walking and cycling compared to anything that was undertaken locally. So that's why, and then in addition, any journeys that they take much further out, like to Nelson or Richmond, are also included, so added on top of that. So they're just making more vehicular journeys. Of course, as electric vehicles increase through 2035 and 2050, the proportion of greenhouse gases from that is starting to diminish. But certainly the VKT element of it is still quite high.
Okay. Any further questions for Drew? Drew, it's quite compelling what you've put in front of us, given that we have got some broader emissions reduction obligations that we've signed up to as a country, and as we're very mindful as communities. And essentially, we're not, what you're saying to us is that it's going to be quite difficult to get us to actually meet the emissions reduction if we follow for many of these scenarios here. So when you go and look at them, that's essentially, what we're looking at, that you've offered some suggestions about how we could further reduce the emissions reduction, but ultimately we've got some real challenges with what the proposal looks at the moment. So it's quite stark in many ways. So I guess I've got a question probably for Jackie and Chris as to, on that basis, and I see your recommendation in the report, which is noting that essentially the FDS in itself, this is a question of weighting, of essentially you've got a clause in the recommendations that says, include in the FDS comment that there are conflicting demands between the climate change direction, housing capacity direction provided by central government, and that balancing these demands is challenging. Given the emissions reduction report and direction that we've got now from the Climate Change Commission, the government's response, should we be putting a greater weight on the emissions reduction element than we had considered when we started the MCA process? Shouldn't this now be given greater weight in terms of our assessment?
Well, I think that it's important to note that in the emissions reduction plan, action 7.4 from the central government itself is to assess the extent to which existing urban development and infrastructure policy programmes, e.g. NPSUD, are aligned with emissions reductions goals. So I don't think we've had a clear steer yet. I think that evidence is still being prepared and is going to come out is with one thought anyway. I don't think.
What was the active word in there? Assess. We'll say that one again, Nick.
Yeah, it's to assess the extent to which existing urban development and infrastructure policy programmes, e.g. NPSUD, are aligned with emissions reductions goals. So I think that kind of signals that themselves, central government has realised there's a bit of a, conflict is the right word, but we're being pulled in all different directions, and they're going to undertake some work themselves to see how they can better align them. So it could well be that we get an update of the NPSUD, or I'm not sure.
Can I just add also that the MCA does already heavily weight, towards the accessibility in the accessibility analysis. So, of all of the factors that we've taken into account in the MCA, that has definitely been weighted quite heavily, as you can see with the prioritisation of those sites and how the intensification sites have definitely scored better, and any of the greenfield areas that are closer have scored better.
Councillor Mailing. So Jackie, one of the comments you made before was that one of the ways that we would manage this, and so Drew's said the staging is going to be important. We need to that's sitting there. We've got the option of including staging in the FDS, so we do have that option. You've given us some advice, and the Barker and Associates report's given us some advice about the options that we could consider on there. So we know staging is there, but one of the constraints or the levers that you talked about is servicing of land. And I'm just looking at one of the pieces of supplementary information that I asked for was around actually that infrastructure provision, and whether the infrastructure was ready to go in the areas that we've seen where they've got intensification opportunity. And it looks to me, looking at that information, the answer to that is no, they're not ready to go. So I guess I've got some questions for what can the panel do here, to make sure that we're doing all we can in building this FDS to actually address this very urgent issue that we've got to do in terms of emissions reduction. Because it's one thing to say, well, okay, we're going to now, and we'll get to that as we start to look at sites, and we'll apply this knowledge as we go through the site decisions on sites to say, well, we won't. We don't want to add greenhouse gas emissions, so we'll look at the one favourably for us, but it doesn't get us very far if, in fact, the areas that we're promoting as being positive in terms of emission reductions are not ready with infrastructure. So what's the solution or the advice that we should be giving back to the councils in terms of that infrastructure provision? Because frankly, this has to be deliverable. So it's no good just saying we'll do one thing on one hand and expect the intensification to come along if in fact the infrastructure is not there to make it happen. I'm sorry, this is going a little bit off your topic, Drew, but what you're putting in front of us is there are some really significant choices we've got to make.
Well, I'll start. Maybe Dwayne can help as well. But in terms of, I can only speak on behalf of Tasman. Chris can speak on behalf of Nelson. But in terms of our largest intensification area in Richmond, that is already happening. The servicing there can accommodate quite a bit more intensification. I mean, if it suddenly dramatically increased, we might run into problems. But we have thought about on-site wastewater pumps, which can be released overnight to try and ease the flows of sewage, basically. Stormwater is on-site detention, and I think water is pretty good. So in terms of our largest intensification area, we can accommodate quite a bit more growth in the short term. The other areas that we promoted for intensification, Motueka and Wakefield and Brightwater, are well, Motueka is more problematic. That certainly needs some more work, and Dwayne can maybe add to that. But the Wakefield and Brightwater areas are relatively contained and could happen now as well. So, any you want to have anything about Nelson's side?
From a Nelson perspective, so the thing with intensification, servicing intensification areas, is that there's no, if you like, one area where there's a lot of density to be planned for. It's difficult to predict where that's going to crop up. And so the approach that we have in Nelson is, when I've had a chat to our asset managers, is that there are essentially buckets of money sitting there in the long-term plan for intensification, but they don't identify specific areas other than there's a general central Nelson area and then a overall intensification servicing budget. And the reason for that was that so we could be responsive to if a big apartment building goes up somewhere or is planned. But the thing also to remember is that there's also additional budgets being allowed or money allowed for in the maintenance and renewals in particular. So when we're doing renewals now, we're looking forward to, okay, what is the ultimate capacity for intensification in this area? So what do we need to do to upsize this pipe? So that's where we're sort of the immediate spend that we're doing year on year, without any proposals from developers or anything like that coming up. We're sort of planning for that to happen at some point anyway. And then, leaving us to be responsive to particular developments as they're proposed.
Just a follow-up question. Just so what you're saying to us is that the FD, so in terms of the growth projections, in terms of the intensification areas, in terms of those renewals, the asset management plans are deliberately future proofing for that growth on the basis that the life of the asset is likely, in most cases, if we're underground with pipe work, is going to exceed the lifespan of this FDS. It's going to go for more than 30 years.
Yeah, so they're looking at what the FDS is suggesting is the capacity for further dwellings in each of the intensification areas, and when they're upgrading when they're renewing, particularly infrastructure under the ground where they don't want to have to dig it up again, they're upsizing all of those pipes to allow for that. So most of that's happening on the trunk main infrastructure rather than the smaller feeder lines. But yeah, that is the approach that we've been taking.
I'll come across.
Can I just add quickly?
Yes,
sorry.
that's all right.
That we to date we haven't really had we don't say no, if you like, to, there is capacity in the system through using, like Jackie's mentioned, engineering methods around on-site detention, all that sort of thing, that we can sort of lean on a little bit to allow these developments to occur now rather than delaying them. But there could be the case where we have a particularly large development be proposed, and we have to say, sorry, we just need a couple of extra years to get everything in place.
Okay, thank you. I'll come across to Dwayne and then I'll come back to Councillor Mayne and Councillor Rika.
Yeah, through the chair. It is, as Chris and Jackie have kind of outlined, a balancing act between cost and feasibility and the risk of capacity not being uptaken. As Jackie has indicated, we've got some kind of approaches for managing where developments occur where we maybe have marginal capacity in the short to medium term. Water doesn't tend to be a problem, but in terms of local reticulation. But it is often a problem for stormwater and often a problem for wastewater in particular. One of the challenges I've already outlined is that if you have a very large area for intensification, it is prohibitively expensive to upgrade all the infrastructure in that area to accommodate for what you think might be the long-term future capacity, and infrastructure upgrades in existing urban areas are an order of magnitude more expensive than greenfield development or laying out new infrastructure for greenfield developments. And to give you an example, I was just thinking about Queen Street here. Most of that work was under the ground, $14 million project for 700 or 800 metres. Upgraded wastewater, stormwater, water supply, everything else. So it's not quite as expensive as that per kilometre in existing urban areas, but it gives you an order of scale. You know, as a rule of thumb, it might cost $1 million a kilometre per service for a greenfield service, for example. So, you know, it is a lot more expensive to provide the same capacity for housing in existing urban areas, simply because you're working in an urban area and all the services that are on the ground and traffic management and all the other things have to keep working while you do that work. So it is very difficult, and then you're dealing with the risk of it not being taken up. So the payback period is a little more uncertain. And so your question is, what could we do as planners? Well, the first is to strike your FTEs, because we do actually use it as a very important guide to our infrastructure planning. The second thing is to create an environment that makes development of the type you want more certain, the sort of thing that you hear from developers all the time. And that way the councils can invest in some of this infrastructure with more confidence in the future. In the meantime, it's, as we say, we work through it as we can. That's a good approach in the meantime, but it does mean we have to be agile, respond with provisional budgets, and sometimes look in the rear vision mirror to see where we've exceeded our capacity. And that often is the case for wastewater, where you actually have 5 times your capacity in the pipe that you need for wastewater, for stormwater. And so you can erode that to some extent, but eventually that's going to culminate in wastewater stormwater discharges and storm events and things like that. So it's kind of managing that balance and that risk. So those would be my 2 answers. Strike your FDS and try to, through the other mechanisms that the councils have, try to provide some certainty that developments of the scale that you're thinking of will occur in certain areas. It provides confidence for the investment decisions.
And thank you. Thank you all very much. That's quite helpful, I think, for our deliberations process. I'll go to Councillor Mailing and then across to Councillor Eager.
Well, it's probably a comment to you, Madam Chair, and it's just in relation to the high growth. And it doesn't matter, it doesn't appear to me whatever we do, high growth is going to be a problem, because that means more intensification, which means larger buildings, which create more greenhouse gases because of the nature of the build compared to an ordinary wooden framed house. So to meet our obligations, that will be difficult. But if we have high growth, we're going to really struggle. And I don't see any way around that, to be honest, because we've got obligations from other national policy statements that say you must provide this housing. So, you know, the two, and it's the same when you're protecting highly productive land. You've got to do that, plus you've got to provide housing. So the two are in conflict, and I think it's just a balancing act. And we have to do the best we can. But if we get more intensification, if you're talking 6 stories, that's more concrete, that's more steel. It's just more greenhouse gases per unit than what you get on a wooden framed house. Simple as that.
Yes, it was an interesting comment yesterday, wasn't it? Certainly for New Zealand, it advances the importance of multi-storey timber structures, which are going to be quite critical to achieving those emissions reductions. So big discussion about how we grow, I think, is what we're working through today. Councillor Eager.
Thank you. Look, this might also be going a little into the wrong section, but it just does dovetail in, but I'm happy for you to defer it to later. But it's just in 16.10 of the report, it talks about including partial staging of information on infrastructure. But then listening to some of these comments around infrastructure and looking at the memo provided on the 30th of May of supplementary information, the way Tasman has sort of got quite sequenced, you know, you've got how many lots are zoned and able to be, you know, serviced in the 6 years, whereas ours is responsive. That was the word, wasn't it? Yeah. Could be also read as little vague, but Yeah. So how do you provide partial staging information when we don't seem to, and the Nelson City doesn't seem to have staging information?
Well, I think the key to it is, well, what we're suggesting is that we have some high level sort of principles, if you like, to guide that staging and the implementation plan. But I suppose what we're suggesting from a Nelson perspective anyway is that there's some, quite big risks in going and planning to service these intensification areas too far out. Because as Dwayne's alluded to, if we don't see uptake of that, and that's where we have the uncertainty. With greenfield areas, we know if we service it, there will be development there. We've seen that, and we know a lot about that. That's with intensification. There's a lot of uncertainty around that, and so being able to have a budget there that isn't for a particular area, but instead is for responding to demand as it comes up, I think is still because Nelson has such a large proportion of its future capacity in intensification rather than greenfields. I personally think that that's still a very good approach, and that it gives us that flexibility.
So is that something, so part of, when mentioning the partial staging information, is that the sort of information you were talking about or suggesting? Because, I don't know if, okay, if you're a developer, you keep up to date on FDSs and, a lot of those big council documents. But if you own, a large old house, you probably aren't. So, if they were thinking, that we might want to do a project, would they know that they could have a discussion with council about the infrastructure or servicing needs? Is that the sort of thing we need to put in here, put in the final FDS?
Well, I think in almost every case we're pretty, I think anyway, pretty good on our website, in that we guide people towards having a conversation with planners or the building team very early on in their project, if they, and then those people are the people that we need to make sure that the planners and the building people, like Shane Overend and the development team, they know about the FDS, and they do. We keep them very much up to date with what's going on, and give them briefings and all that sort of thing once the FDS is adopted. And I think that is our sort of connection, if you like, with that.
And then my final question, just rounding it back to greenhouse gas emissions a bit more, is different building materials. Because I remember talking to a company maybe 6 or more months ago who were looking at multi-storey timber or timber product buildings. So do we anticipate seeing more of that then might resolve some of the conflicts that Councillor Mayling was talking about and was raised yesterday?
I'm not sure any of us is an expert in any of that. I do know there are some challenges around, say, taller timber structures, and that the ones that have been built around the region, that you have to be very careful about your timing with regard to weather. You will have seen places like the NMIT, where there was a lot of additional work covering the timber structures up before it was all completed. So there are some challenges around that. I know there's been stuff in the media around that, but that's really to be seen.
We know what we know today, but things might change that reduce some of today's challenges or conflicts. Thank you.
I'll move to Aina on Zoom. Kia ora, Aina.
Oh, kia ora, Madam Chair. So I have a question to the officers, please. It's in regards to infrastructure. So the question is, what are the processes applied to recognise Mātauranga Māori in regards to the cultural impact assessments regarding the infrastructure? So I'll repeat that again. What are the processes applied in regards to recognising Mātauranga Māori within the cultural impact assessments applied to the infrastructure? So let me highlight some of these things. In regards to stormwater discharge, wastewater, the three waters basically, I'm aware that there are somewhere in your system, cultural impact assessments have been conducted. What level of implementation regarding those impacts do you apply from those reports in your processes?
Thank you, Jackie.
So I'll start, maybe Dwayne can help too. Sorry, Claire. So just to clarify, I think the cultural impact assessments will only exist where we've generally had resource consents put forward. So a lot of these FDS sites are way ahead of that. We're not even at that stage yet. Just want that clarification. In terms of the issues that you've raised, I think some of the most pertinent things are, for example, the transfer of water from different catchments and those kind of things. I might just let Dwayne speak a bit more to that.
Can I just add furthermore, not only the cultural impact assessments, but also the cultural monitoring reports. I'm very much aware that the Hapu have spoken to me about cultural monitoring reports in regards to some areas. Have you, yes, so in your assessment or in your implementation application of Mātauranga Māori, are these documentations taken into regard and made in effect?
I'll just clarify that point maybe first and then pass over to Dwayne and Claire. Just the way the process has worked is we've had several hui with the iwi of Te Tauihu, and we've gone through the FGS principles on the individual sites, and those notes have all been recorded of hui, and there is a section in the technical report that goes into a bit more detail, but that's how we've actually obtained the feedback from iwi, and that includes things like servicing too.
Kia ora, Jackie. Thank you.
Through the chair, the language of cultural impact assessment is around here at least. It's more something that's undertaken through the plan change or a resource consent process. So I can assure you that where Te Tauihu have indicated it's important that cultural impact assessments are undertaken, and it either forms part of the consent or the engineering plan. But that's at the end of the process, really, not the beginning. And from an infrastructure planning perspective, what my team does is we partner as much as we can with Top of the South iwi, Te Tahi iwi, to plan our infrastructure. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that. We have a rolling series of urban area catchment management plans for stormwater being rolled out, and we develop that together with tile staff from the respective iwi. So it's a conversation with them, and they are partners in developing the proposals, and we workshop it with them and with council. And that manifests in the catchment management plan, which is the high level direction that we want to set for a particular urban area. We're just going through the process at the moment of setting out, I guess, a long-term vision for wastewater treatment and disposal in the district. And that, again, is a process we intend to take together with Te Tauihu Māori. It's not a cultural impact assessment per se, it's more of a partnering in terms of thinking through the problems and all the usual planning process that you go through. So I can give you an assurance that that is the way we already do business, and it's going to become more of the way we do business in the future.
Kia ora, Madam Chair. That's absolutely brilliant. I'm not aware of who I'm actually talking to, and who actually spoke.
Oh, kia ora, Aina. That's Dwayne Fletcher, and Dwayne is, you can tell us what your title is, Dwayne, because I'll get it wrong if I try and guess.
Kia ora, and apologies for not saying who I was in my title. My name is Dwayne Fletcher. I'm the Strategic Policy Manager here at Tasman District Council. Part of my team includes the infrastructure planners. For example, Drew here is in my team as well. He's been talking about transport.
Oh, look, that's really fantastic to hear what you actually spoke about in regards to Te tauihu at the decision-making table with you moving forward in collaboration regarding your infrastructure planning and strategy. That's the answer that I wanted and was leading up to. The language in regards to cultural impact assessments and cultural monitoring reporting is just a pathway to open this doorway of conversation. Thank you. You've actually answered a lot of our questions, and it's a positive collaboration strategy that you have with the iwi and the hapu. Kia ora.
Thank you, Aina. I'll just come across to Claire Barton and she'll tell you her title as well.
Morena, Aina, it's Claire Barton here, Group Manager Environmental Management at Nelson City Council. Just to add to that, we have a process which actually some other councils are now looking to adopt, where we've engaged iwi very, very early in our infrastructure projects. So much so that we actually provide them with a list well in advance before actually going through to our long-term plan and annual plan processes. They then sit alongside us in that process, provide input, and also make sure that any monitoring, etc., is undertaken in accordance with Mātauranga Māori and their requirements.
Oh, absolutely fantastic. Kia ora.
Thank you, Claire.
Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui. Kia ora.
All right, I'm conscious that Drew's hour's up. He's going to depart somewhere else. So we've got any more questions for Drew? I think Drew, you've done an excellent job of producing that information for us today. Really solid information, and we'll certainly apply that in our thinking as we go through our deliberations process. So thank you. Is there anything further that the officers want to highlight for us in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reduction? We captured that?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, we've finished that topic. All right, I am thinking that we might, rather than try and start on the recommendations, I think we might just try and get a couple more topics out of the way before we break for lunch. Is everyone happy to have to break a little bit later for lunch, or would you rather go at, we go 12:30 if you like? All right, 10-minute break now and then through to 1. Will that work for everybody? You think? We'll take a quick 10-minute break and then we'll come back and we'll work through till 1 o'clock. Stand adjourned. Just note that time is not back. We're ready to get started. And we're going to move on to the building heights topic. That's the one that's next. So Chris, are you going to lead off on building heights?
Yes, I am.
Thank you.
What's with all the chuckling around the room? So there was quite a few submissions that raised this. I think probably most in relation to Te Hunanui, but also the wood as well. And also there were a few that raised it generally. And the issues raised were sunlight restriction to neighbouring properties, and then loss of the current low-rise urban aesthetic, conflicts with the previous messages from the community in Te Hunanui with the Te Hunanui structure plan, and the loss of views for neighbours for hillside intensification sites. I think it's quite important to remember, and I know we keep banging on about this, but we're not doing a plan change as part of this. This is the FDS. This is sort of, there's a much bigger process to follow this, where the plan, any building height changes would be have to be considered in a lot more detail. This is really just indicating the mix of housing that we would be expecting to be able to meet these capacity targets, that we to meet our demand, if you like. The NPSUD in itself indicates a strong preference for intensification by trying to essentially favour clustering of housing around infrastructure and existing infrastructure, transport links, that sort of thing. And for us to be able to get that level of intensification based on the feasible sites that we have, that we've assessed, we do need to be looking at taller buildings. If we don't, we either have to look at further greenfield provisions, or we need to would be relying on a much higher uptake rate on a site-by-site basis. You know, of all the sites that are feasible to develop, would be relying on that feasibility. Or more people have essentially taking up the opportunity to develop their sites at a much lower level, if you like. So we also have the added complication that there's very much a tipping point, if you like, with the number of stories. And we've talked about this before, where there's 3 stories, and then beyond, where it's quite a relatively simple process to build 2 to 3 stories. Beyond that, there's a point where you need to start providing things like lifts and sprinkler systems, and the costs start going up. And so there's a point there around 4 or 5 stories where it's a bit challenging to make things stack up. And so you need to have that flexibility on a lot of sites to be able to go to that 6th story as well. So they're all, again, depends on each of the risk profile for each individual owner, but that's, you know, something to consider in the mix.
Thank you, Chris. Open for questions for Chris. Councillor Ogilvie.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I asked the question earlier on about heights, and I think probably even Janine may have answered it, but is there any data which relates the height of the building, say with 5 stories, in terms of a lot of emissions when you're building it, concrete, steel, etc. But the theory is that the number of people there will walk to work, walk to do whatever they like to do, and therefore long term will mitigate and balance, I suppose, the emissions caused through the concrete and steel construction. Is there any data along those lines at all?
We certainly haven't looked for that, but yeah, I'm sure someone's done some similar work at least. We could maybe tomorrow, if we can find something overnight, I can certainly have a look to see whether there's anything along those lines.
But is that appropriate to what we're looking at, though, in terms of the FTS and recommending building height requirements, to have that data available? In terms of particularly GHG emissions impact.
Through the mayor, there's the FDS, as we know, is a high-level strategy. I think there are other avenues such as the Building Act and the Building Code, which really govern the building design and typologies and how greenhouse gas emission efficient they are. It's not something that the FDS can control, so probably not is the answer.
Thank you. Councillor Mayling.
I've just found a study that says exploring the CO2 impact of building height. Just did it now in 2016, so it's certainly been looked at elsewhere. So it's definitely been done overseas.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Eager.
Yeah, just a couple of quick questions. Just in relation to 17.5 areas of historic buildings, do we have any heritage overlays or design requirements? You know, so like I know in Tasman there are, you know, recessive colours and things like that if you're on ridge lines, and you have to be down off a ridge line, and et cetera, and you know there's colour rules around buildings. Are there rules or any overlays in the Nelson heritage areas?
I'm not entirely sure. Again, not being a planner, I'm not using the CRMP on a regular basis. But Claire might be able to.
So through the mayor, there are, if I've understood the question correctly, Judine, there are provisions in the current NRMP which identify heritage status and character areas, for example, and those would need to be considered.
I guess I'm looking at impacts on those areas of height, as was raised by submissions. But then I guess there's also, when it's a heritage area, impact of design on those areas. So, you know, because you could have a multi-story building that fits in beautifully because it has, you know, there is some form of heritage design requirements or design rules that, you know, require X, Y, Z. And so that's where I was looking at, you know, there are different impacts of new buildings in heritage areas and how we, if we've already got rules that address those.
I would need to have a specific look at what it covers, but certainly where there are heritage character areas, those broad aspects about amenity on that heritage character would need to be considered through a consent, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just my other question is just around the role of structure plans and other documents. So Tahuna submitters made quite a bit of reference to their structure plan that I believe is yet to be adopted, but either way, you know, so there was mention of neighbourhood plans and structure plans, Tahuna, Mapua type residents. What's the role of those in, I guess, supporting where multi-storey development might go? Because I know it's not going to go everywhere, you know, it's just the, you know, area of potential. But what's those roles and where do they sit in the process?
So the structure plans, well, the way I see it anyway, is that they align with, I suppose, the more modern, the language we're using with the FDS would be the implementation, sorry, the neighbourhood plans, which are part of the implementation plans. So yeah, taking that at that next level down, if you like.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, and I think that would be maybe important to note, because I know, you know, there were a number of communities where they raised, you know, structural, you know, Port Tarakoe also did, you know, whether there's some form of other planning. So to me, it would probably add value to be able to note that in the final FDS, just where they sit. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just busy scurrying around trying to find the papers on this one. There was a recommendation from Barker and Associates on neighbourhood plans. If just we captured that in the recommendations in the report.
It was in the implementation section of the draft FDS, the reference to neighbourhood plans and structure plans. I'm just wondering if one of the implementation resolutions has captured it. Just have a quick look.
So I think this is a quite important element that we need to bring through.
So I don't think there's a resolution specifically on the preparation of structure plans and neighbourhood plans, but it is in the implementation section of the draft FDS at the moment.
All right, we might just make a note about that and come back to it. I think I did raise it by email. It might have been one of those supplementary questions, or it could have been one that I did subsequently on the weekend. So we'll just make a note around that if we can for the moment to come back to whether we should make a recommendation on neighbourhood plans.
Yeah, that was in one of my original questions I sent through.
Here we go. Yes, we have. Okay. It's in B. It's in B. Okay, that's the one specific to Tahuna Nui, but generally the need for having neighbourhood plans is one of the recommendations for implementation that's in the Barkers and Associates report. And I'll try and locate that a bit later on, but if somebody could just make a note about that. It's not material at this point in time. We'll capture it later. All right, any further questions on building heights? Everyone's got what they need for their deliberations? All right, thank you. All right, thank you.
Just a really minor question, or maybe minor, because it wasn't raised in submissions, but just is there any potential impact on flight paths for Tahunanui Heights, or that would be dealt with at any private plan change or resource consent stage?
So yeah, yes, that would be considered. It's sort of considered in the MCA with reverse sensitivity effects, but that's more related to noise than building heights.
Yep.
The building heights issue would be in a plan change.
Yep. And we have that within the NRMP.
Yes.
Yep. Lovely. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Councillor McGurk.
Just a very quick question. Just in the analysis of the feedback that we got, because when we put out the proposal, I think it was 4 to 6 stories along that corridor along Tahunanui Road, but for the rest of from Tahunanui, what was that block? It was the distinction made between, I think it was 3 blocks identified in Tahunanui.
Yeah, so there was the 2 that essentially one each side of the
Tahunanui Drive, yes.
and then the third one was the Roto area, and that was the 2 to 3 story townhouses.
So the fact that we're within the airport corridor, does that will have an impact, or the noise?
Yes, so we've scored that in the MCA with the reverse sensitivity. Yes, and we do deal with that in the strategic assets or strategic areas section of the, of the report.
Right, I found my note. It was just on that supplementary information that I think we've loaded up yesterday, and that was in relation to, can we include specific recommendation on the should say to the councils, but NCC particularly, we're preparing neighbourhood plans for existing parts of the city, and I'd reference the 20-minute neighbourhood concept, but it's more than that. It's actually this broader discussion. Would this come back because of part of the further work on principles for staging and implementation? So you've responded, it will be part of the annual implementation plans, but just for the joint committee, are we going to, when we bring this back, because we've got a 2-stage decision-making process, or it might come back to the subcommittee or joint committee, we've got some further things that, as we go through to adoption, there's some work that needs to sit in behind this. Are we going to get to see that, what the principles around the implementation plan look like? Because that relates, but it relates to these issues, and it also relates to staging.
So I think at the moment the resolution on that is worded in a way which is that the staff will draft up some principles and they will be approved at the time of adoption of the FDS. So there is a resolution on that.
Yes, that was okay. So we will get to, so that will be at the adoption stage.
It's resolution 5.
Okay,
yeah.
So Jackie, I'm just thinking that as we start to think about the mechanics of that and making sure that we are able to transact both the adoption and acknowledge the implementation plan principles, I just want to make sure that in some ways the subcommittee is actually, right across that process, because otherwise my concern is when it finally comes up for adoption, usually the adoption decision is a reasonably quick one, isn't it? So, we've done the work, we've got it organised, but actually those principles are going to be absolutely critical to actually achieving the outcomes that we're talking about. So I'm just wondering how we're going to get to have some some oversight to make sure that when we come to the day of adoption, we're not finding that we've got a problem.
So we can probably amend that resolution 5. Susan, were you going to say something?
Thanks, Susan.
Through you, Madam Mayor, what we can do is that we can circulate a copy of the principles to you for your, at the time when we draft them up, for the committee's sort of consideration and for you to comment on prior to them being actually formally incorporated in the final FDS draft. So we can circulate that separately to you. Happy to do that.
Would the subcommittee like to have that opportunity to see those principles? Just so that because I think a lot of the things that we're talking about here as we're going through our deliberations process, many of the actual action end of it is going to happen at the implementation stage, but the principles are going to be quite critical to achieving the outcomes. All right, so we'll take that away and work on a bit of a process around that. We don't need to do that as part of our deliberations process. We just need to have a mechanism for it. Councillor Eager.
Just as part of resolution 5, just wanted clarification because it says which will also involve consultation with infrastructure providers. And I'm just not sure what that refers to. So are infrastructure providers providing input on the principles for the implementation plans? Is that what that means?
Through the mayor, I think it could do. It's also referring there to the sort of ongoing work that we'd want to do with infrastructure providers such as Waka Kotahi, Ministry of Education, DHB, Kayanga Ora in implementing the FDS. So it's sort of both really.
Okay, I'm just wondering about timing of that consultation, if it's coming to.
All right, I'll just come across to Susan. Another comment.
Through you, Madam Mayor. Thank you. The intent of that was, and it's probably not clearly worded, and we can play around with that, I think, is that the implementation plans would involve consultation from infrastructure providers, and that was that came out of a discussion at the workshop the other day, where you'd indicated to staff that you wanted to ensure that other infrastructure providers were involved in the preparation of those implementation plans. So we might need to just play around with that wording to make sure it's clear that that's what that consultation relates to, not to the principles.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, no further questions on building heights, then we'll move on to the next topic. What would you like to do next?
So it's natural hazards next, I think.
Right,
Yeah.
that's good. Who would like to present on natural hazards?
I think Chris is going to lead on that. I've also got Diana Worthy on the screen and Glenn Stevens who are available to help.
Kia ora, Diana. Kia ora, Glenn. So if you feel you need to, if you want to speak to any of the items, just use the raise hand function and we'll keep an eye on that and we'll come to you.
Kia ora, thanks, Madam Chair.
And we just have a page reference as well, Chris.
Sorry, what page? Yeah, 54.
Thank you.
Is that you guys have you all found it on 54? Is that right?
Yes, I'm on
theme
54.
12.
It's theme
Yep.
12.
Okay. So this one is actually most specifically related to the sea level rise issue for Te Hunanui and the Wood. That's where it was most raised by submitters. And they were questioning why we'd included those areas at all. And we have talked about this. It's all those areas, if we put aside the even if we include the natural hazards scores in the MCA and didn't treat them as a go no go constraint, these areas score very, very well because, of course, they're very close to the city centre for Nelson and a whole range of facilities and community facilities and infrastructure. It's all in place. And so the decision was made in the absence of a climate change adaptation strategy, which is being worked on currently for Nelson, to include those areas because that inclusion of those areas in itself would help inform this decision making when you're going through the DAP process. In that, if you've already got an area there that's got $3 or $4 billion worth of infrastructure in place, or assets, public and private assets in place, and that may be a tipping point where you're thinking, do we protect it, do we retreat, all the different options, and then suddenly you have consideration of, well, actually there's potential that that could be intensified, and suddenly you might be protecting $10 billion worth of assets, and that may tip into a different decision making, tip you towards a different decision. So that was the rationale behind including them. Now, to be clear, and what's expressed in the draft FDS is that even though the areas themselves were shown in the FDS document, the capacity that we calculated for them was not included in the totals that we used to meet the demand target. So if, for example, they were removed, that wouldn't have any impact on the numbers in the FDS. It would just be on the areas shown. So if we get through the DAP process and it shows that yes, it's worth allowing further development in those areas, for example, then our intensification capacity would increase. But at the moment, it's not included.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
So your rationale for leaving it in is that when it gets to the DAP process, we need to be modelling a couple of scenarios. In other words, we need to be modelling out the intensification scenario and the existing urban form
It's certainly
scenario.
something that's useful to take into account, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. All right, so any questions for the team on natural hazards? Diana and Glenn, if there's anything you would like to add, please just speak up. No,
Just a comment, perhaps. The sea level rise details are on page 307 in the attachments. Are they going to be part of the FDS or information, or is it just for our own information?
What was the page reference? Sorry,
307 following the notes which Rob Bell gave us a year or two back, Jackie.
Just trying to remember where those features. Sorry, I'll have to have a look. Are they in one of the attachments, are they?
Yes.
Do you know which attachment?
Oh, I don't know. It's page 307 of my.
That's
the
307.
subcommittee requests.
Oh, the questions and answers. Right, so they're not part of the draft FDS. No, they were just circulated in response to questions and for the public to see. Yeah, and we did have, the reason I've got Diana and Glenn on the call really is we did have quite a few questions from you about whether the FDS takes into account things like the NZ sea level report, sea level rise report that was released recently, and the IPCC report and that sort of thing. So they are there to talk to that if you want them to.
All right, Councillor Mailing.
Just a question. What's the height of Te Hunanui above mean high tide? That's all. Any idea, Chris?
I'm not sure, sorry.
I gather it wouldn't be much, but it might be 2 metres or something like that. Because I know down here in Richmond West, we start at 3.5 down near the coast, but it gets up to 5.5 above mean high tide as we get to Queen Street. But then when you get further down, past the MDF plant, it's much lower. So, all right.
Thank you, Councillor Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Chris, just at 18.4, you talk about the DAPP being completed in time for the next FDS. So I'm just a little struggling, sorry, in the rain. What's the interim till we've got that process completed? Are you just going with information that you currently have? And how much will you think that DAPP will change for the next FDS?
So the information that we've used in scoring the site is the sea level rise, the coastal inundation information that we currently have. That the DAP process is less about gathering that information and more about how do we respond to that information. So how do we adapt essentially to that? So they're slightly different processes, if you like.
Right.
Yeah. So we still have used the same information or very similar information to score the sites.
Okay, thank you.
No further questions? Oh, yes, Councillor Ricker, apologies.
Sorry, and just following on from Councillor Ogilvy's question, and just sorry with the rain, I may not have heard the answer. So we've got in the attachment and in the answers to the questions, the recent updates on the IPCC 6 assessment on predictions and the MFE sea level rise projections. So will they go into, I don't anticipate all of the attachments to go into the technical report, but because this information is supporting the assessments, because this is technical data, will there be an addendum to the technical report of, I mean, say for example, the you know, the VKT analysis and some of this data, because it just feels a little maybe disconnected to have it as part of, just as part of this process, and that if someone was picking up the final FDS, you know, there is, you know, they wouldn't see some of this latest technical analysis we've used for making decisions. So is there a thought to have an addendum of the technical reports and updates?
So just through the Mayor, the technical report will be updated anyway because there have been a few changes. So there's no reason why we couldn't insert some of this into that technical report. Yep.
Yeah. I think it's important. You know, I know it's a process and you need to follow it through, but people also need to pick up the final FDS and including the technical report and see the basis of decisions. So that would be great. Thank you. That can be noted.
Panel members are happy with that suggestion? Yes, yes, there's nodding. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, if there's nothing further on natural hazards.
Can I just add one further thing? Very minor thing.
You can, Chris, yes.
It's just a very minor thing. We had submissions about specifically about the Tahuna Nui slump core area, and that was an oversight on our part. And that area, just to be clear, wasn't in one of the main intensification areas. It was in the overlaying pink and white hatched area, which was the infill over the general rest of the built urban area, if you like. So that was an oversight on our part, and we're recommending removing that from the final maps.
All right, that's good. And I'll just check that legally we can do that. So this is a change to the proposal because it was an error. So we've had advice that that's okay.
Yes, and we also received a submission on it, so we can do it.
Good. Okay, that certainly clears up an issue that was causing me some concern because I was puzzled as to why they were there. Okay, that's the end of natural hazards. And now would you like to choose another topic? 15 minutes size topic? We were suggesting strategic assets?
Yes, we're just...
Good.
Great minds think alike.
Good call from Councillor Bryant.
Sorry. Strategic areas, yeah. So that's theme number 13, so page 55. Just checking that page 55 is consistent with what I'm looking at as well. Good stuff. So we received a couple of submissions on, so one on Port Nelson and one on the Nelson Airport. And so the one on Port Nelson recommended or wanted to see residential development on the port land, essentially, in that port area. And then the Nelson Airport submitted that they would prefer that the FDS areas didn't include any area within the 55 decibel noise contour. So if we deal with the port first, one of the key things that was raised in the submission was that the dividend that the council's received from the port was pretty low for the value of the land that was essentially wrapped up for that activity. And while that might be true, there's also the wider issues to consider in that the port has a much higher strategic, much larger strategic role in providing for the region as a whole, and doesn't just provide financial return to the councils themselves. And so as a strategic asset, it's important that the core activity that the area is for isn't compromised, if you like. And if we start eating away at the area that the port has for its activity, then there's the potential that we would compromise that. So we're suggesting that the port area isn't included and that hasn't been assessed further. Now, for the
If there's any questions on the port area first.
Sure.
On that. No questions on the port. Thank you,
Okay.
Chris. We'll move on to the airport now. Oh, sorry, I know. Yes, my apologies. I does have a question.
Oh, kia ora, Madam Chair. So what you're saying here in regards to the port, which I totally agree on, is that the port is a no-go development area. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Right, we'll move on to the airport.
Now, the airport is possibly a slightly more complicated issue in that the 55 decibel area in the deliberations report, you'll see that similarly we're treating the airport as a strategic asset or a strategic area, and recognising their request for removal of those areas inside the 55 decibel noise contour. So we've suggested removal of the Roto Street area in 102 and part of in 34, which is that Tahunanui Drive West. So we've recommended that they be removed.
Thank you, Chris. Any questions for Chris in relation to the airport? Councillor Riga. And I think we are going to have to speak up. I'll try myself because that rain is. I know. I don't know if it's raining in Auckland, but it's really raining here in Richmond. It's quite noisy.
Oh, kia ora, Madam Chair. So I left the rain, did I? I left the rain for you.
Yes, you did leave the rain for us.
It's sunny here in Tamaki.
Oh, beautiful.
I just wanted to, it's actually about the supplementary information dated 31 May 2022. And there was just the response to the interest, whether there was any interest for NCC and TDC panel members. And I just thought for completeness, the last sentence says, there is nothing showing in the interest register for Tasman councillors. I just think because the memos are forming part of the official record, that it needs to be updated to clarify and confirm it's Tasman councillors and Nelson councillors.
Any questions for Chris? Nope, it's nothing on the airport. Oh, yes, Councillor. Yes, Brian's got one.
Just clarification where the 55 dBA contour is approximately.
Sorry, so it basically cuts out 3/4 or over 3/4 of the Roto Street area. So it runs along the eastern, almost the eastern edge of that Roto, the N102, and then cuts off a small part of N34, the western side of that. There's a the bit closest to the beach, if you like.
So does it align with any road or not really?
The 55 decibel noise contour doesn't align with a particular road, and that's why we've sort of we're suggesting is something that aligns to roads a bit closer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, it would be helpful if we could just see that one, but we'll bring that back when we get to sites perhaps, unless we've got it now. We have got it? Oh, great.
So
can I just reflect back on the submission from Nelson Airport Limited, what specifically did they ask for? Did they ask for removal of all of this area? What was their submission focused on?
Yeah, that's it.
Sorry, if we just have a look.
In one.
So we can actually overlay. I think the noise contour. I think the noise contour is in there. Is it? Oh no, maybe not. Maybe not. It's okay. So it basically runs up the almost the eastern side of N102 through. See how sort of through almost straight through there. So you cut off the where N34 juts out, if you like, towards the beach there, or not the beach. What are we? to
So that line would be
Pull
sort
it
of
up.
intersect with the roadway into the reserve that heads into Natureland. Is that about right?
round about there.
Okay.
Yes.
So just reflecting on Nelson Airport Limited submission, what degree of what was their specific request?
They asked that it be those areas be removed, but then the language they were using in the rest of the submission wasn't quite as they did in the beginning of the submission. They've asked for that, but the rest of the submission was a lot more considered and recognised that there was more to consider than just the airport. Yeah.
It was more considered than just the airport. In other words, that they were reflecting on the fact that they're part of a community.
Well, yeah, amongst other things, yeah. But I suppose what's pushing, what's driving the recommendation was that it wasn't just the airport. We have a few different things overlaying one on top of the other, and we have, the airport, we have the resistance from the Tahunanui, the residents in Tahunanui that submitted were opposed to any increase in building heights and even intensification in general in that particular area, wanting to maintain a sort of seaside village sort of feel. And then on top of that, the sea level rise issue. So really, it was just a couple of extra things that sort of started to stack up that made us push us towards that recommendation, if you like.
All right. Chris, I do remember that I had some questions in our workshopping process around, had we considered, if you're taking it out for residential, because that's essentially what you were looking at it for, what about commercial purposes? And have you turned your mind to commercial need?
We didn't go down that path because our commercial, the whole way through the FDS, with our HBAs go and identify that we have adequate land already zoned for our for business purposes. And obviously we have included some business areas, but they're to serve those townships where they have a more localized demand, if you like.
Yeah, if I could just add to that. So what Chris is saying is that overall the demand can be met by sufficient capacity, but we've got these disparities between the different towns, which is why we have quite a few employment sites being proposed in Tasman, because although we're meeting demand overall regionally for both the regions, there are certain towns that have got shortages. So yeah.
Right. Any other questions in relation to this one? I'll go to Aina.
Kia ora, Madam Chair, just to continue that conversation in regards to the airport development and my comments. Look, I sat at the airport yesterday evening and looked at the realistic location itself and the attraction to the general public going to that area for commercial activities such as a high-level retail outlet or whatever could take place in that area. I think we're creating a new community to attract that new community into that area. And I think there's enough commercial businesses, as stated from the officers in that particular area. I'm in agreement that based on the airport location and those public health safety issues in terms of noise and also the aviation rules, I'm in support of the recommendation made from the officers. So kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you. Right, there are no further questions. That concludes strategic areas or assets, depending on how you want to look at them. That section's finished. Would you like to stop now? It's 5 to 1. We can stop a little bit earlier and have a break for some lunch. Perhaps come back at either 2:15 or 2:45. What would you prefer? Panel, I'm going to have to go to another meeting, so I will be gone from 1 till 1:45. I've just got an appointment I can't move that I need to attend. So really it's up to you. So you want to come back 1:45? Happy with that? All right, we'll resume at 1:45. All right.
Kia ora tātou. We have some technical issues at this end. Mayor Rachel here. We don't have, you won't be able to see us on screen. We will be able to see you. So we'll keep an eye, I know we'll keep an eye on the hand up function if we need to come to you. So we are able to do that, but apologies that you won't be able to see us. So when we're talking, it'll just be important that I either say the name of the person that I'm going to next, or if I miss that, you to say your name so Ina knows who it is that's speaking. We can cover that off and hopefully we'll get this fixed. So our next topic is the new sites and amended sites proposed for exclusion. So Jackie, are you ready with that item?
Yes.
I'm just wondering for Ina, are we going to be going through the sites on the screen?
We are actually, yeah.
So I wonder how that's going to work, or with how we can.
If we share that map, and can you do that?
Share screen should.
Yeah.
Share screen should still work?
Yeah.
That's great. Kia ora, Madam Chair, I can see that.
Okay, good.
Excellent. Oh, that's good. All right, I'll hand over to you, Jackie.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. So Jackie Dean speaking. So we're going to do theme 14. That's the new sites proposed through submissions, the sites which the officers may be proposing for removal, and sites which are proposed for amendment, whether that's through a submission or again through officer recommendations. So through the submissions, we had quite a large number of new sites for consideration. Tasman had 32 new sites, although 5 of those were amendments. And Nelson had 4 sites, 2 of which were amendments. Now, the new and amended sites are all listed in paragraph 20.3. Just to clarify, it's a little bit ambiguous, the wording of 20.3, but what we're trying to say there is those are all the sites that were proposed through submissions. Not all of those have been recommended for inclusion. However, all those sites in paragraph 20.3 were assessed against the same multi-criteria assessment as previously and using the same staff members as well. Just important probably to say that where one of those new sites scored as well as or better than any other previous sites in the draft FDS, and they align with our preferred spatial scenario, which is focusing growth largely along State Highway 6 in Mapua, Motueka and Tasman's rural towns, then we did consider the inclusion of the site for the draft FDS. And on occasions that led to the potential removal of some sites that didn't score as well. In addition, we've also thought about the new sites in the context of how they're going to accord with the purposes of the FDS, the intended outcomes, RMA and LGA considerations, and whether the changes are generally in keeping with what the community has sought through submissions. So once we assessed the site, we noted who'd proposed it, because there were some cases where the site wasn't proposed by the landowner. So we contacted the landowner to see if they were in support of the proposal. We also contacted surrounding landowners of the sites to obtain their views on it being included. And there were some sites in Tasman which are in parallel being proposed for rezoning through a new growth plan change. And so we spoke with the team involved in that and we obtained the feedback from the community on the boundaries of those sites as well. So Chris will just go through the Nelson sites, then I'll go through the Tasman sites.
All right. Well, just for everyone on Zoom, it's Chris Paulson, Nelson City Council here. New sites, sorry. 123 Halifax Street was the first one. Now that one scored quite well under the MCA, but was opposed by iwi on the grounds cultural heritage significance. And so to be consistent with how we've treated all of the other sites when that has been the response, we're recommending not including it in this FDS. And then we had, so just as an aside, we've obviously talked about the airport, the removal, the proposed or recommended removal of the 2 airport sites as well, N102 and part of N34. but that isn't covered here. That's covered under the strategic areas section, rather than us go and repeat ourselves multiple times through the document. And then if we zoom to these two general Saxton area sites, 115 and 116. Yep.
Just take these reasonably slowly, just so that we're all clear on what we're looking at, just because we're moving the screen around a lot.
So then 115 and 116. So Maya, could you show where Saxton Fields is? It's the green area. Yeah, so that's Saxton Field, the green area there. And Champion Road runs up. Yeah, N100 there, the boundary of the, yep. So both areas score well under the MCA, the multi-criteria analysis, as you'd expect given their location sandwiched directly between Nelson and Richmond. So we're recommending that both of those are included. So 115 is 18 hectares approximately, and we'd expect to get around about 162 additional dwellings, and 116 is approximately 64 hectares, and would expect 245 additional dwellings from that. So even though 116 is quite a large area, it's pretty up and down. It's reasonably steep in places, so we're allowed for 1,500 square metre sites on average across that area.
Right, questions? I wonder where you'd gone, Judine. Councillor Rika. And I think we're back. I think we might be back on screen now.
Look, just with 116. So where is it connecting from? Because 115 connects from Champion Road.
Yeah.
What's the main thoroughfare for 116?
So we're anticipating that 116 would connect in through Ngāwhatu Valley.
Yeah. Okay. And so, gosh, so how did it rank on like active transport then? Because it's then getting quite, narrow, far flung, no public transport, etc., etc. So there was a couple of assumptions we made there, and that would follow similar sort of development patterns as we have in the Ngāwhatu area, where there's walking and cycling links independent of the main carriage, roading network, so that the links would be a bit more direct. Right.
And we made that assumption because the landowner of 116 is the same owner as the surrounding land, so there's potentially some scope there. Right. And we thought that was a reasonable assumption to make.
Okay, and then just in relation to what size sections did you say?
So on average, we allowed for 1,500 square metre sections.
Is that because of the terrain?
That's because of the terrain. So, but keep in mind that that's the average size. So there'd be smaller, and there's probably going to be some balance lots around the gully that runs through the middle, and yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to Ina.
Kia ora, Madam Chair. Just in regards to, you mentioned sites of significance to iwi. Can you just confirm that, please?
Sure, that was the 123 Halifax Street. And that we had a response which was because of the short time frame that we had for iwi to respond between us getting through the hearings and us scoring the sites and then asking for feedback on the sites, and this deliberations report being due, we had essentially a traffic light, red, green or orange on a lot of these sites, and the 123 Halifax Street was red flagged.
Okay, so that means that further consultation with iwi is concerned regarding these particular sites?
For 123 Halifax Street, that's
N115, N116.
So N115 and N116, when we did our first round of consultation, or talking through these sites, when we were discussing N11 and N112 and N100, we specifically asked, what about the remainder of that site? And we're told that it was accidental discovery protocols would apply, as once the site was under development.
Okay, I understand. So it hasn't been confirmed whether or not it's Waihi Tapu.
No, so Chris.
Sorry. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So therefore, it hasn't been confirmed that these sites are Waihi Tapu. Is that correct?
It was confirmed that they're not significant.
Okay, so they're not Waihi Tapu.
No, that's right.
All right. Kia ora. Thank you.
Thank you. So just in terms of any questions of this, the N115 and N116, we were just discussing the transport links, and the scoring. So can you just give us the scoring again as to how they scored?
They scored well overall and ranked amongst the ranked right at the top of the greenfield sites.
Right.
As you'd expect, because of the accessibility score being weighted as it was, and so to not include them would be
right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Councillor Mailing.
Well, I'm very supportive of these two sites. It's great that the landowner has changed his mind, and I note there's new infrastructure up through Nawa too. That's been put in the last few years, and there's more development going up there still, as I see, because I visit that area reasonably regularly.
Okay, thank you. Now, just for the panel, how do you want to approach this section? Because as we're going through this, we're going to have our detailed discussion about each individual site, and so I think I'm probably going to be wanting to get an indication from you as to whether you agree or disagree with the officer's recommendations as we go through. Otherwise, we're going to do an awful lot of backtracking. Are you comfortable with that as we go through? All right, so let's start with the first one, which was N113, and that one was to be excluded, or not to be included.
123.
Oh, sorry, 123.
Halifax.
Halifax Street, 123 Halifax Street
Yes.
is not going to be included.
That's the recommendation. Yes.
Okay. Everyone comfortable with that approach? Yes, that's fine.
Aye.
Right, thank you, Anna. Now, in terms of, did you want to do? I'm just going off my agenda, Chris. So, did you want to do Port Nelson now? Or not? No, actually, I need to use a different page to do this, don't I? Oh no, it should work. Yes, Port Nelson.
Yes, well, we covered that under the strategic
earlier today,
areas,
so I think we're in agreement with the recommendations from the officers. Yes, aye.
Aye.
And then we're now on to Saxton Extension 11N115. And anyone got any concerns about this one, or are we in agreement? We're in agreement. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.
Aye.
And now we're on to Orphanage West Extension recommendation, and we're in agreement. Aye.
Aye.
Is it a no? No, yeah, no, it's an aye. Okay, right. Okay, so it's just that we're indicating here as we go through. Now, next one.
Well, if we're going to cover the port one, then we should probably. Do you want to cover the airport, the N1, the?
Yes, please. We might as well do that while we're here.
So N102 and N34. Sorry.
Okay. Now, I'm just going to try and run that from the agenda as to where I'm going to find that. So if I'm in the section new sites to be removed and amended, I'm not seeing those N numbers.
They're under.
Oh, they're under the other areas. They're under the strategic areas. Yes, they're further up on that page. So if we're on page 56 of the agenda, they are the options there, which is to remove N102 Roto Street and part of N034 Tahuna Nui West Drive. And that's the recommendation from the officers, I take it?
And
okay, right.
It's at the resolutions, it's 3.1.17.
Sorry, could you just repeat that one?
3.1.17 is the
3.1.17.
yeah, is the
That's a
resolution.
okay, all right. So at the moment, I'm just working off the body of the report to get our indications. Oh, okay. All right. Councillor Eager. Yeah, just a question about N034. So is that the revised N034 or the original that I'm seeing there?
That's the original. Yes.
So what's the revised look like?
So the revised essentially cuts off the that area to the where Maya's indicating, the area to the west of that.
Okay.
Essentially that whole area there gets removed.
Is that in our maps anywhere?
No, because we haven't gone down the path of doing that yet. That was going to be post whether you resolve to remove it or not.
Okay, I just think we need to see the final map before we. I'm
So
happy to make an in principle decision.
That's all we're doing today, in principle.
Yes,
So
but I would want to see the final map before we sign it
All
off.
right, so we're doing our indications.
Yep.
We'll probably go back to the recommendations to do the in principle again, just to be sure, because the numbers have moved around a little bit. So this is the recommendation that we remove N102 and part of N034 inside the 55 decibel airport contour from the FDS. All right, happy with that? Aye.
Aye. Happy.
Okay, thank you. All right, now we're on to Tasman, I think. Okay, so Tasman sites. She started with Brightwater, Maya, T198, Falcon Ridge. That's the one, yeah. All right, Jackie, just one thing I think is helpful, and I did talk about this earlier today, that the work that Drew did for us, I think, is quite helpful in our thinking. And there is in the supplementary report the bar graph that is in the blues and the greens, and I just have to remember what the table number is. Susan, have you got the number on that?
It's figure 1 in Drew's report.
Yes, figure 1 in Drew's report as we go through these, because he's got them pretty much laid out, not by the ends, but just in terms of those issues that we might like that. Well, I should say I am going to be taking Drew's that bar graph into consideration as I look at these. So amongst a range of other matters, but it's just helpful to have it there. All right, so Jackie, sorry to interrupt.
Okay, thanks, Mayor. So we start with site T198, Falcon Ridge Winery, Higgins Road, Brightwater. This site was proposed, I'm at paragraph 20.21 of the report. This site was proposed through submissions, and when assessed, it scores better than the comparable rural residential site at Teapot Valley in Brightwater, T54. It's the Falcon Ridge site is the 91st best site in terms of ranking, whereas Teapot Valley was 138th. We didn't have much feedback from the landowners of the Teapot Valley site during consultation, although one landowner did seek for his land to be added to it. We are therefore proposing site T198 instead of T54 for rural residential at Brightwater. We've contacted surrounding landowners. 5 are supportive, 2 are against, one of them citing concerns about chemical spray drift from their nursery. We also heard back from one more landowner since writing this report, and they are not opposed to it either. So there's basically 6 that were happy and 2 opposing. Other landowners that did support it, a few of them have mentioned the flood risk that occurs near the road, which we're aware of. This was identified when we assessed the site, and we acknowledge that the northeastern corner of the site may not be suitable for development. That's all on that one, I think.
Questions on this one? Councillor Eager, and then I'll go to Ina. Yes, can you just remind me how far this is from Brightwater Township, please? Oh, sorry, David.
About 2 k's.
Do you want to measure it there, Maya?
We can measure it on the map. I haven't got a measurement to hand, I'm afraid.
Yeah. I like it.
So it's about 2 kilometres.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, from there.
Yeah, because you got the underpass.
No, but yeah, from there on the site, which is, yeah, okay. So yeah, maybe up to
Three. Okay, thank you.
All right, any further questions?
No further questions.
No
Madam
further
Mayor.
questions. All right, thank you. Councillor Rieger.
Yeah, so why is the proposal for rural residential and not residential, which would align with T001?
It was proposed by the landowner for rural residential. The terrain is not flat there, so there could be issues of getting good densities out of it. But it was, I mean, TO1 is obviously not serviced either. That would be a big servicing investment by council if that goes ahead. And there's obviously that land in between, which has not currently been put forward for development. So we assessed it as it was proposed. We assessed all the sites as they were proposed by the landowners, and this was proposed for rural residential unserviced.
Councillor Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Jackie, just a question in relation to water for the site. They would all have the required 2 water tanks for potable water, wouldn't they?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
So there wouldn't be no water.
Not if it was rural residential, no, no.
54 lots.
So very crudely, we've worked out to about 80 lots, but that's probably not taking into account the corner of the land that we think we can't develop. So it's probably on the high side, actually. Yeah.
Between 40 and 50, more realistic, probably.
Councillor Maylam.
Yeah, it is close to that infrastructure that runs up the old railway line. So if it could be connected to the infrastructure, which is going to get an upgrade in the future. If I'm looking across at Dwayne and he's busy looking at his computer, but it wouldn't be that far to run a line over to there if that happened in the future, would it?
Through the chair, Higgins Road is looking like the most likely alignment for upgraded water services through to Wakefield from Brightwater. So there probably is a very high chance that there'll be a new water main running through there. The council has tried to preserve its water resources for urban level development, but it is possible there'll be still a capacity because we've yet to build it to accommodate other sites if that was required. The other thing I would say is that wastewater capacity in our trunk mains and in our treatment plants are a scarce resource. And yeah, definitely would be discouraging, wastewater connections from rural residential sites, which have the ability to service their own wastewater, and preserving our capacity for urban level development for wastewater.
Councillor Rieger.
Yeah, see, yesterday I asked just for some data on rural residential and the split between the sort of conurbated urban area versus the rural townships. Did you have that information?
Yeah, so through the mayor, I've got that today. So of all the rural residential sites in the draft FTS, there are some which are near to Motueka, Brightwater and Wakefield. The rest are nearer to Takaka, Murchison and St Arnaud. So of the ones that are near to Motueka, Brightwater and Wakefield, those sites would yield about 1,200 dwellings. Of the ones which are nearer the rural towns, they would yield about 400 dwellings. So there's about a 75%, 25% split at the moment in terms of dwellings that are near urban areas, rural residential, and those that are near the rural towns.
And the HBA didn't look at rural residential demand, is that correct?
That's correct. It's not something that we can really measure.
Right, no. Okay. Yeah, I guess just those stats maybe, to me look slightly misaligned with where some of the submitted demand express that the rural townships need to have rural residential. But what we've got is only 25% of rural residential sort of supporting the rural townships and 75% supporting the urban/urban rural mixed towns. So did we look at that prior to the draft?
Probably not in that way. I mean, the reason there's that kind of split there, I suppose, is that we need 24,000 dwellings in the urban environment and 5,000 in the rural towns. What we tried to do with the rural towns was find as many sites as possible that could be good standard residential sites near to the town centre first. And there's places like Tarkaka where there's lots of constraints, so you end up getting pushed further out from the town anyway. But the starting point was always to try and find central sites and then move out from there. So that may be why there's only a small number of rural residential sites for the rural towns.
And finally, because this isn't a zoning exercise, I mean, like I get that a landowner, you know, they will ask for I'll call it an overlay, whatever, you know, because it's not a zoning, you know, that you know, suits maybe, you know, the profits they're after or, you know, whatever else. But, you know, do we look at, you know, did we look at other factors before just sort of going, well, this is what was requested in the submission? And I don't just mean for this one, I just mean for, you know, any that came through. You know, did we look at what was the best fit for that area or that site versus what the submitter necessarily requested?
Through the mayor. So we did on occasions. There's a couple of sites that come to mind that were proposed for residential where, because of flood risk, we actually looked at a commercial on the ground floor and then residential above. Otherwise, putting residential on the ground floor, that site wouldn't have made it through. That's an example of when we did that. For this particular site, we did consider standard residential, but according to the notes, we determined that the water supply was insufficient to service this site at the moment. So if we had assessed this site as a standard residential service site, it would have scored much worse because the servicing isn't available, and that's weighted. So we then considered what we've been asked to assess a site for, which was rural residential.
Okay, thank you.
I just got a question for Dwayne. Dwayne, I just want to follow up on your comments before around the wastewater network and capacity and how so essentially what I'm hearing is you'd rather preserve the capacity within the wastewater network for where you can't dispose of wastewater on site, right? So that's essentially is there a question here as to whether that's therefore driving a settlement pattern that is actually not very helpful for the emissions reduction outcomes that we're trying to seek? I mean, I'm just wondering whether the better thing is actually to upgrade wastewater services so that they are able to support a greater intensity here of perhaps residential, in this case, if it was residential development that is reasonably proximate to a township.
Through the chair, my concern is primarily around rural residential where they have an opportunity to dispose of their own wastewater. Them disposing of wastewater on their own land means it's discharged to land. Otherwise, it's conveyed quite a long way to be treated by one of our central facilities that one day will probably need to come inland as well. It just creates an unnecessary burden on the wastewater system that can be managed in another way. In terms of urban level density, our expectation fully is that commercial and residential developments of an urban nature will be serviced by council provided water and wastewater networks.
Okay, thank you. So just weighing up, so just thinking about that from a perspective of environmental outcomes on this side, it would be, you know, what you're saying to us, it's better for it to be disposed to land because it can be. Otherwise, the actual cost of disposal and then the discharge into the ocean environment, all but that it is treated before it gets there, is the lesser preferred option.
Yes, it is. And I guess the point I'd make is that there are many thousands of rural residential sites collectively around the district, and you know, they are left to their own accord when it comes to wastewater. We don't have, you know, I know this is a new site, but we don't typically service most rural residential site, there are some accidents of history. We do have water in places and we do have wastewater in some places that are rural residential. But going forward with a scarce capital, we have to invest in new growth areas. Our priority is in urban areas.
Okay, so in this case, if this one was able to be connected to active transport networks, and we could get some gain through that, then we potentially get not necessarily the yield you'd get off that land, but what Jackie's saying to us is it's got some issues with it in any event. But we're managing to get a reasonably efficient outcome. So Jackie, the second question I've got, so I'm thinking out loud, which is never a good thing, is are you, I'm not, you know that I'm not overly keen, I think I've made that up for the reasons that are set out in Drew's graph, but also because I don't think rural residential is a particularly useful tool for affordable housing, or the housing choice where we've got people that just cannot afford to even rent or buy. So are you removing some other rural residential somewhere just to balance this out? I think we probably need to understand that.
So this site, let's say the yield will be about 50, something like that. We're actually proposing to replace it. So site T54 to the north in the brown there, that's the Teapot Valley Rural Residential site. That was a much bigger site. That was more like, I think it was 280 dwellings, that one. So we're proposing to remove site T54, but we prefer the Falcon Ridge site, which does have the Great Taste Trail running by it. And it scores slightly better for a number of reasons. So although it's a smaller site, capacity wise, that's okay. We don't need the dwelling, the numbers.
All right, sweet. So let's just do those numbers now. So we've got T054 is out, so we're proposing for that to count. So we might as well have these conversations, I think, at the same time if we can. They're not necessarily direct trade-offs, but I think they're sufficiently related. So we've got a proposal to put T198 in and to then remove T054. All right. 255 versus 50. So it's 255, Susan tells me, rural residential across a T054.
That's
and
right.
54 coming here. Okay,
Yeah.
so
you're losing about 200.
Okay, all right. So any further questions on that? Because I'll try and do these both at the same time if I can. It may not be possible, but are we comfortable with the recommendation on, or accepting if you're not comfortable, the recommendation on T198?
Yeah.
Okay, and then the removal of T054 Teapot Valley. Happy with that? We are, yes. Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to Wakefield now, to Pigeon Valley. We've got a new site T200, which is in blue there at the top. So this was proposed by one landowner on behalf of two landowners, but we have spoken to them both now. They're proposing to extend site T32, which is another rural residential and service site, with that site adjoining it at T200. In the report, you'll see at paragraph 20.22 that officers are suggesting making both those Pigeon Valley sites rural residential. So originally T28 was proposed to be serviced standard residential, and site T32 was unserviced rural residential. Because those better sites have come forward in Nelson, better standard residential sites that Chris just talked about before, the proposal was to actually reduce the overall number of dwellings here and make both sites unserviced rural residential. And what that does is it more than halves the number of total dwellings that would be in this location, and therefore associated greenhouse gas emissions as well. Also, the Pigeon Valley site T28 didn't score particularly well as a serviced residential site in comparison to the Nelson ones, but as a rural residential site, it scores much better. So the yield, would drop from about 1,200 to about 600 for those two sites, 28 and 32. We've contacted surrounding landowners of T200 because I thought that was a new site. We contacted 5 surrounding landowners. We're still waiting to hear back from 3. 2 of them were unsure about the proposal. One of them was concerned about the proximity of the site to forestry and potential for wildfires. But we've noted in the report that there's quite a range of factors that contribute to likelihood of wildfires, including the amount of fuel source, the remoteness of the location, access and egress, the design of the houses, etc. And if it's low density rural residential housing, there's probably scope to provide sort of fire bunkers around the houses and that sort of thing. In terms of active transport, there are planned bus services to Wakefield, not at this stage going up Pigeon Valley Road, although they could be extended in the future. For active transport, there's likely to be a gravelled share pathway in this area in the future. And that's it.
Right, open for questions. Councillor Mayling.
Right, Jackie, first of all, when I look at the T032, I can see an awful lot of houses, and I know that area reasonably well. So it's already very fragmented in lifestyle type. So there's already a large number of dwellings within there, and it is hilly. So I can understand why it was rural residential. The question about the area that was down as residential, so that becomes unserviced. What impact does that have on our infrastructure going forward? Because that was included, I think, in our 30-year plan, wasn't it, Dwayne?
Through the chair, we included it in our Infrastructure Acceleration Fund application on the basis that it had been included in the FDS for consideration. We were not successful in getting funding for that, by the way. But it definitely, whether this is in there, it makes a big impact on the size of the reticulation. We're planning on constructing the one I mentioned before about water retic and to Wakefield, and wastewater retic away from Wastefield. That will be constructed within the next 10 years, I'm absolutely certain. Whether the site is in or out will be quite influential in sizing those pipes, particularly the wastewater, because you've got to get that right first time. Otherwise, it's pretty much locked in until such time as you upgrade those pipes for your purposes. So yeah, at the moment, it's probably the marginal cost of including it is probably not too bad from a retic perspective for the work we've planned. One day, though, if you included that area, we would have to extend reticulation out to it, provide new reservoirs, et cetera, and there is a substantial cost associated with that work.
Any further questions?
Just that you can't see it on here, but again, T028 again is heavily rural lifestyle blocks at the moment, and it also that would include the golf course, wouldn't it too? Is it? And yeah, I think it does.
We drew around the golf course to exclude that, actually. Yeah.
But so it's already and there's new houses going in there right at this moment. I saw last weekend. So yeah.
Thank you. Moving on to Councillor McGurk.
Yeah, thanks. Just looking at your report, I think it talks about T28 and T32, about T28. It's got a combined yield if they're both rural residential and the standard residential 1250 sites, both down to 600. But what's the yield with T28 if it just remains as a residential?
It was about 940, something like that. So it's a big site.
Yeah, 923.
Okay. Any further questions? I'll go on to Councillor Eager. Councillor Ogilvie, did you have questions as well?
Yeah, so apologies. I'm trying to follow you on the list, and T028 isn't even on the list. So I'm on page 56 of the agenda, and I was trying to follow site by site, but some of these sites aren't even here. So is there a different place?
Kia ora, Madam Chair, it's on 64 and 65. That's where I'm reading. I'm skipping as well.
Okay. Do we have one comprehensive list? Because it's sort of like if there's different information in one part of the report to the start of the report, which was here is everything, but then it's not everything.
So I'm going through the report. I'm going through the detail, as I mentioned, paragraph 20.23 for these two sites. If you go to paragraph 20.47, that lists all the changes to the Tasman sites, and it says change existing site T28 typology to rural residential from standard residential and add adjoining site T200.
Okay, so why is that different to the list at the start of this section?
Let's go to Susan. She's
Sorry.
helps out.
So I'm just going to help explain that. Thank you. In 20.3, they are just the new sites. That's just a list of all the new sites that have been proposed through the consultation. So, and of course, T28 and T32 were already in the FDS. So they're not new sites, they're just changes to existing sites. So I think that's the difference, is that that list in 20.3 is just the new sites.
Okay, it is a bit hard trying to go to 3 different sections for one discussion. So T200, and this is proposed to be something rural residential. Why do we need more rural residential there?
It was proposed by the landowners, and when assessed, it scores as well as T32. Therefore, we had a duty to consider it.
And T32 is currently zoned, or no?
No.
T32 is what?
Proposed for rural residential.
But then you're proposing to change down some, for residential. Did you say rural residential?
Rural residential.
And T28, you're wanting to change it.
That was standard residential, and we're suggesting it should become rural residential because it scores badly when compared to the new Nelson sites that have come forward as a standard residential site. So we felt to change them all to rural residential, that reduces the yield of the houses by half, reduces greenhouse gas emissions, etc.
So then, okay, so the key question then I have is, I mean, it's a little problematic that it scores badly to the extent where rural residential actually becomes a preferred. So it's a serviced site.
Yeah, it's because we've weighted the servicing, so as a criterion. So if a site's not going to be serviced, it potentially will score better. If a site is expensive to service, like T28, that will score badly for servicing. If you say it doesn't need servicing, then obviously the score comes up.
Sorry, but I thought you said T28 was serviced.
It was originally proposed for serviced housing, but yeah.
So I'll just go across to Ina. I'm just going to, I hope you don't mind me doing this. I'm just going to indicate my thoughts on this at the moment. What I'm seeing is things, the servicing weighting is encouraging and enabling rural residential, in my view. If I was to listen to this, that's the conclusion that I could reach, is that it moves around because it doesn't need infrastructure servicing, it moves to rural residential. And I'm looking at Drew's graph, and this is right at the end in terms of emissions reduction, adding to our GHG issues. It's right at that, it's not looking good sitting out there. Mind you, neither was Falcon Ridge, which we talked about, which is why we're doing this in principle as we go through. And so I have to say, well, I hear that it didn't score well if we're just looking at T028 for residential compared to the Nelson sites. I'm not sure that's a good reason just to flip it across into rural residential. So I'd say at this point, I couldn't support that call, but I'll go to Ina, and who's been waiting, and then I'll come back to the chamber.
Oh, kia ora, just to add to this conversation, Kit and I, Kit kindly took me on this site visit. I agree with that TO28 in terms of it not changing into rural. And the rural, however, there are established homes up there. And if it's a matter of infrastructure costs, that's your weighting, isn't it? You can't afford to actually develop that area into that complete area into a residential development, nor change that residential area, TO28, into a rural development based on the weighting rules. I'm in favour to the recommendations made from the officers. I can see their rationale in this decision made. What does concern me again, I'm in I question that T200. I do question that one.
All right, so that's the one that's further away.
Yes.
All right. Okay, thank you. That's helpful feedback. Who do I have next in the chamber? So Councillor Bryan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I'm not even sure who this question's to. Just in relation to, has been alluded to, servicing, perhaps drain. As I understand it, we currently have no active plans for servicing this area if it was to be residential, and if we did, it would be hugely expensive, is my understanding. So rural residential is coming out better because they can have on-site wastewater disposal and potable water tanks. So that's one of the main drivers, because as I understand it, would have to wait for water was available from the dam and pump it up to Pigeon Valley, and wastewater would be downhill. But of course, there's the issue of getting it over the Pigeon Valley Bridge and into the trunk main, which is undersized. So we're probably looking at something like huge telephone numbers and years away.
Through the chair, there's two parts, I'd probably say. The first part is the trunk main infrastructure that we intend to upgrade mainly between roughly Brightwater or O'Connor's Road for water through to Wakefield. And that reticulation is in our 10-year plan, and depending on what you recommend the councils pick up in terms of this site, we will make sure that reticulation accommodates a future T28 site in terms of its ability to convey water or wastewater. That's just between Wakefield and Brightwater, if you like. Once you've got that base, then you need to think about, in this case, extending your reticulation out to Pigeon Valley. That isn't in the, I don't even think it's in the infrastructure plans that we have. The process we run is we take as I said before, we take a very strong lead from the FDS, and we include infrastructure in the future to accommodate the FDS. What I would say about this site is I think the team have, and Kim is hopefully on the line there somewhere. No, he's not. I think they have costed out what it would be for wastewater and water, and it is tens of millions of dollars to provide wastewater and water services to the site, less so for stormwater, because fortunately you can probably create a channel to the Waiti. Drew behind me could probably talk about the roading, and I believe the road itself needs an upgrade. But you are talking tens of millions. That's where scale matters. So a site like this with 951 potential residential sites, that's big enough to warrant, $30 or $40 million of additional infrastructure extended servicing out to it. And that's a reasonable cost per dwelling. But essentially, that is the two parts of the problem. We've got a decision we've got to make in the next 10 years to know whether we upsize our water and wastewater infrastructure, and that will effectively dictate what happens to the site if it's not included for a long time. If it's not included, I guess one of the trade-offs you make is if you transfer it to rural residential, is that site will lose its long-term potential to be a residential site. And for a future council or a future Three Waters entity together with councils to do whatever they want with it, even beyond the 50-year mark. Drew, did you want to comment on transportation at all? Sorry, Alessa.
Yes, through the chair. In order for T028 to become a residential dwelling, we would actually have to upgrade the entire length that's encapsulated by that area into an arterial type urban road. In addition, we would need to look at the intersection of Pigeon Valley Road and State Highway 6 and look how we catered for turning in and out of Pigeon Valley Road, but also crossing the State Highway to get to the other parts of Wakefield, which would become the town centre or for the residents that would be up there, the urban residents, that is.
So we could be creating another Richmond West where the township's divided by the road.
Through the chair, that is indeed a concern. At the moment, State Highway is separating Wakefield, and this would potentially add to that.
Further questions, Councillor Ricker?
Yeah, I guess, though, in light of those comments, why then was it originally planned to be residential?
My question.
In the current FTS, in the draft?
So through the mayor, this is an original site from back in 2018 when we didn't have as many sites to choose from, I suppose. It was an original site that went into the last FDS and has been reassessed, and as better sites have come forward, it has gone down the ranking order, which is why if we left it in, it would be our worst performing standard greenfield site in the FDS, and we'd have more capacity than we need. I'm not saying that we can't do that, but that's how it sits now.
I guess my question is, but how in the reassessment of the site did it get to be residential with the wastewater and transport issues that have just been raised? Because surely those issues aren't new from when we put the draft FTS out, 3 months ago or whenever it was.
Well, as Dwayne mentioned, we originally were going for the Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, and this site was part of that bid for the whole of Wakefield, and that has now changed. We didn't get it, so.
Is that part of the MCA though? Because I mean, there might be other government bids and things.
Through the chair, I guess the fact that it costs tens of millions of dollars to service a site is kind of in a way neither here nor there.
That's right.
I mean, we have a costing for servicing Richmond South there, which is more than that. Admittedly, is twice as many homes, but it's kind of on scale. So, I don't know if that's a key thing to determine. I think Jackie mentioned before that other sites in Nelson have come on, and for other reasons, they are preferable.
And I guess finally, so this sort of juggling around of residential to rural residential. So is that within our scope? Because were there any submitters who said TO28 should become rural residential?
There were some submitters who suggested that part of it could become, could have some rural residential lots within it.
I'll go to Aina.
Oh, kia ora, Madam Chair, and thank you, Deputy Mayor. A lot of your questions were the questions I was about to ask as well. So in terms of the change from standard to rural, is that so to decrease rate? Is there a rating cost to the ratepayer or to the landowner? Is that why this was suggested in the submissions?
We'll go to the officers.
You probably don't need to answer that. Look, last week in the workshop, we did discuss these sites. And so what you're asking here, even though you've got it here in option 1, so you've got it here actually as one of your recommendations. That's correct. So do you want this remaining, change existing site T28 to rural residential from standard? Is that what you want? Do you want it remaining there, or do you want it removed completely?
So we've suggested as officers that it remains in the FDS, but as a rural residential site, T28. And, when the FDS is reviewed again in 3 years' time or whatever, and we have a clearer view again on what we need, then maybe in the future this again could become a standard service residential site. But at the moment, we don't need the capacity numbers for service residential. We've got better Nelson performing sites. And that's why we're suggesting the whole area becomes a rural residential site and decreases the number of people living there, really.
Well, look, thank you for that. Well, on my site visit, there were quite a lot of lifestyle blocks out there, quite a lot of wealthy people. Is that the case?
I can't really comment on the people that live there, but there's certainly lifestyle blocks there at the moment. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Kia ora.
So I've got just a couple of things to run through. We must be taking development contributions for both transport and the three waters if we're developing out here. Where would it be residential? They'll be part of the DCs. So yes, it might cost. No, for residential. Yeah.
Through. But the additional infrastructure to go from Wakefield through to Pigeon Valley, I even if they're in our asset management plans, and I can't recall, I'll have to check them. They almost certainly won't be being charged for via DCs at the moment, because that charge will go on to existing Wakefield residents, whereas the project might be 20 years away. So at some point in the future, a future council or Three Waters entity will start including those in their DC net and start increasing their charges to accommodate that.
Thank you, Dwayne. And Jackie, where else is Wakefield going to develop if it's not? So if it's not, we had this was included for residential because there was a need for somewhere for Wakefield to develop in a residential way. So where else?
Well, there's a few more sites in Wakefield. If Maya just goes, so all those yellow areas there, T110, T194, the pink areas, intensification areas, T29, 30, T107, the sort of greeny yellow areas, they're all proposed in the FDS as well. They were in before when we consulted.
And have you got an estimate of what they yield?
I have. I can go through those. Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah. So T19. Oh, actually, Mike can show you on that. So T194 is 200 roughly. Okay. The intensification areas are quite small. They're probably, that's a 93. Yeah. That's 12. It's a very small one. Yeah. 107, I think it's about 100 altogether. So it's not missing. It's 100 houses altogether in 107.
Growth projections for Wakefield. Obviously, it's a bit of chicken and egg here, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that it's not really solely related to demand for Wakefield. We've got to remember that a lot of our other towns, such as Motueka, Brightwater, Richmond, have constraints. So we were looking for Wakefield to be one of the larger growth areas for the district. So we're not necessarily matching demand and supply for every town because we can't do that. So, for example, Motueka, we can hardly meet any demand. So it's not really about, a correlation between those two.
Right, I'll go to Councillor Ogilvie.
Madam Chair, thank you. I ask you the question, do we need 228 in the next 30 years?
Well, I'm certainly turning my mindset. What I'm considering, exactly, you can see the cogs going around in my head. Because what I'm considering is the submissions that we've had, and what they're saying to us, and the very clear message that they've said. I'm looking at Drew's graph that's in front of me. I can see the value of 900 residential sections sometime in the future, and the ability to bring that one back. Probably the opposite of what Jackie was saying before, you could take it out next time, but I'm almost saying, well, you need to bring it back. If that was the case, you might think that. The only quick question I have is in terms of planning that infrastructure, you need to start, it depends the sort of lead time you'd need to start thinking about that as to how much time you've got to make the decision. If you've got another 3 years to call it, then you've got another 3 years to call it. I'm just thinking about the objectives that we've been trying to achieve. Absolutely supportive of the township model, and I think there was strong support in the submissions around that. But ultimately, there's no easy choices here. It's probably where I'm getting. There's no easy choices, but there is issues around timing that we could consider.
But if we're looking at 28, and we think the next 30 years, it ought to be or should be residential, we should leave it as residential currently. I'm beginning to think. And when a plan change comes in, then they'll know the cost, and the staging in comes in as well. Not formally, but informally. So therefore leave it as residential is where I'm coming from. I mean, I don't know what Dwayne or Drew or Jackie, their comments in terms of development, but for numbers and for the future of Wakefield, by 2052, do you expect it to be residential?
I mean, there's definitely two sides to this argument, if you like. In terms of overall housing numbers, we don't need T28 now. So in terms of those FDS high projection numbers, we don't need it. So we've got the Nelson sites that have come forward and some other sites. And yeah, there is an argument for saying that it's more efficient to use the land for standard residential than rural residential. So if you want to retain that option, then you would probably retain it as standard residential. Yeah.
Well, I think it's quite almost impossible. It's compromised at that point. Councillor McGee, then back to Councillor Maley.
I think in light of Drew's, did that go through your MCA, your model criteria analysis to? Did you review?
Did what go through? Sorry,
just emissions one. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yes, so Drew has looked at Pigeon Valley. Go on, Drew.
Yes, through the chair. Yes, indeed. I did look at that when we reassessed it. I did introduce the well, actually, Pigeon Valley was already in the initial one, but when this one came in, we just increased the Pigeon Valley rural residential lot numbers to include this, and decreased the Wakefield community residential to offset it. Sorry, does that make sense? So in other words, we've already got so we've already had a Pigeon Valley rural residential area.
Yeah.
So I increased the lot numbers from the greenhouse gas emissions perspective to take into account the new rural residential T28. And then I deducted out of the number of dwellings out of Wakefield the residential areas to take into account the changing from residential to rural residential.
So if we were to leave 328 as residential, what impact would that have on your greenhouse emissions, greenhouse gas emissions?
Sorry, through the chair, per household, it probably makes very little difference. Yeah.
All right, I'll go to Councillor Mailing and then.
So if I think back 3 years, we didn't have the Rainland in here, which to me is a much better site in terms of the two districts together, because it's in between Stoke and Richmond. So to me, it must score much better in terms of greenhouse gases and everything else. And if we don't need these two sites out there, I'd take them out. Totally.
We'll take T28
all through. No, take a lot out. Yeah. Because I would rather, but if you lose one of the sites in town, and I'm thinking of Kaka Valley, then you don't have the numbers. And that's a plan change issue. So, so brings you back to address this again. So to me, that's why I see Kaka Valley being very critical, and also the range, because that makes the compact city instead of, because, you're talking 25 Ks plus, no, it's more than that. It's over 30 Ks from Nelson to Wakefield. And then you're going beyond there up this valley, which is already fragmented into lifestyle blocks, and they are relatively small. So the question I would ask Jackie is, how difficult is it to bring it back in the future? Because in 3 years, you will know about those other two critical sites in Nelson City. One of them's in there because we've got a willing landowner, and I'm talking the Rain property. But the other one is going to be a bun fight, but it's not ours. It's in another forum. But to me, if you don't have those two in Nelson City, I think we would be really in trouble.
Yeah, we have got those. They're quite big sites to have come in. All right, I'll go to Councillor Edgar and then Councillor Bryant, and then we're going to have to try and make a call on this one.
Yeah, so look, Councillor Mailing has probably said a lot of what I was going to say is, sort of based on, because I just have an inherent problem with combining sites so they rank better. And so for me, T028 dropped out of being of good residential value because of Nelson sites. And that to me is wholly positive, because we're trying to keep the urban area together as much as possible, and just reflecting the greenhouse gas emissions that supports our active transport, reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, etc. So sort of flicking it into rural residential to me sort of undermines the fact that we've got this robust MCA. It dropped down as being standalone residential that we needed. So therefore, to me, it should come out. That we need more rural residential, I haven't seen in our urban area, as we call it, for the FDS. I haven't seen an argument for. And so, yeah, I would probably support the removal of, well, all three, T200, T032, T028.
All right. Councillor Bryan, would you mind if I go to Susan for some advice before we come to you? Is that all right? All right. So, no, it's not. No, it's not high priority. It's just for context, because you may want to respond to it. And just in introducing this, one of the things that I'm really conscious of, and this is the real downside to statements of proposal, and you all know it. So you all know how it works. Is we have to put out our statement of proposal. That's the proposal, and after we do that, we can only amend. Sometimes if we make a mistake, we can do it by mistakes, but we're constrained on what we can do by the submissions. So what I've asked Susan's been thinking about this. What submissions have we got? Because we've now got to make decisions from that point. We can't rewrite the statement of proposal at this point. That's out of scope. So that's why I just want to get some advice on that as to where she thinks we are on that.
Well, I think we need to consider several things. One is the objectives of doing a future development strategy, and that is to provide sufficient land for the long-term development over the next 30 years for the district. These sites, if we did remove them, provided everything else pretty much stayed in, we would still have sufficient land to meet the development. So that's the first thing we need to tick off, I suppose. The second thing to consider is the fact that we did go out with a statement of proposal. In the statement of proposal, T200 was not in it. T32 was in it as rural residential, and T28 was in it as residential. We have had some submissions on T28 suggesting that part of it should be converted to rural residential, or there should be some rural residential type development within that site. We've also had a lot of submitters saying that we should be focusing on intensification and not focusing on greenfield development. So there are arguments on both sides for that. The other thing, there was something else that I was going to say that was important, and I've just forgotten. So I might just need a minute to.
Is it about the landowners, Susan? The landowners?
No, it wasn't specifically. So there is the issue of the significance in terms of how the degree of change that we're proposing. Bearing in mind that you have had a lot of submitters. I know what it was. You have had a lot of submitters saying that they would prefer intensification to rural residential. The other thing you need to bear in mind, though, is that you've heard from 553 people, 68 people, 568 people, or submissions on behalf of families or groups. There are, between the two districts, there is about 100,000 people. So you have only heard from a small proportion. So you have to also bear in mind what the wider community may think, and whether whether you think you've heard from a representative group. So that's something for you to weigh up in your decision-making roles. If you were to look at taking out T32 and T28, I won't talk about T200 because that wasn't in the proposal. You are talking quite a major change to the proposal that you went out with. You would have to have very good justification and a good understanding of the community views in order to make that. So that is your decision as to whether you have that information, adequate information. So I don't know whether that's been a help.
No, it's been Susan. Thank you very much. Councillor Bryan.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So just as a variation on Councillor Maley and Councillor Egar's thing, I would support leaving T32 in, as that's very suitable up there for rural residential and quite limited to the number of potential lots. In fact, a lot of it is very rural residential now. It's been continually being subdivided for some substantial time now. which is predominantly the Richmond, the South Branch of Pigeon Valley. And I would take T28 out and leave that as potentially for future residential in time, if and when we can get the infrastructure there. If it's out, you've always got the option to bring it back in later. If it's rural residential, it's much harder. So I think that would be perhaps a way forward and satisfy those that are after some rural residential as we went out with and T200 I'm neutral on that. I don't mind either way. It's much of the same as it is in the other branch, the North Branch rather than the South Branch, but very closely connected.
Thank you. I'll come across to Ina.
Kia ora, Madam Chair. So just coming back to the weighting chart in regards to natural environment, Te Manawa Wai, and the ecology and the biodiversity. So T200, T032, well, basically all of those three areas there, if they are developed, what impact are they going to have on natural environment?
Thank you. Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you. I need to go through the spreadsheet, so you'll need to just bear with me. So T28 scored well for terrestrial ecology and biodiversity. It got the highest score. Te Manawa Wai, it also scored well for, and therefore also scored well for impacts on life-sustaining quality of natural resources. T32 was the same as T28, and so I think T200 will also probably be the same. So they've effectively all scored very well for those criteria.
Okay, kia ora, Jackie. So that's current analysis, right? So if you
is,
develop those areas in the future, say the next 30 years, that those statistics are going to change, aren't they?
Did you say aren't going to change?
They are. They will change. If these sites were developed and increased in development, those statistics that you've just stated, they'll change. There'll be an impact on the environment.
No, because we've scored each site on the basis of that development proceeding. So we've thought, what will that development do to this land?
Okay, so that's your 30-year projection?
Yes.
Okay.
Sort of, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Look, the reason why I'm asking, I'm just going through the list of criteria and then marrying up that assessment to compare.
No, I know it's understandable. No, it makes sense. So so essentially, when you did that scoring, that was with T28 being residential or rural residential.
Does it not? We've done it as both actually. So the first time around we did it for standard residential. Second time around we did it for rural residential. So it's not made much difference. Both those sites have scored very similarly.
Okay, right. Because presumably is it because there are not tremendously large, are the attributes, in fact, natural attributes quite low? Overall,
yes, it must be. Yeah.
So there's not a lot to protect there.
No, that's right.
It's not that you're enhancing the environment through the process. So that's one of the other things that, we haven't got a criteria for. That's a genuine question. So does the MCA provide for, does this enhance the environment? So we go through that process.
That's what we've considered. Yes, that's right. And I have got detailed notes on them all, but it would take me a few minutes to get them up. So okay. If you want them, I can get them. But yeah.
All right. Okay. We're eventually going to have to make it some sort of. We're giving direction at this point with getting to our own principles, and so we've got a range of views, and somehow I'm going to have to untangle this. So we have ranging from kind of all out, all in, or T28 remaining as it went out, which is residential. Dwayne's got something to say, but just before you do that, Dwayne, given T032 is essentially the housing typography in there is rural residential now, isn't it? Pretty much. It's from.
Yes, is it zoned rural too, I think.
Yeah, so do we need to do anything with it at all? I mean, this is the question of what the FDS is sending direction, and I'm going to go, so we're sending direction to confirm and support rural residential. And in fact, if it's kind of like that anyway, what's the gain in doing it? You know, what's the
I suppose there's quite a bit of land in there that isn't still developed, so the yield you could potentially get would be more than what the housing is there at the moment.
Right. But if that was the case, do we need to do anything about it? Won't the landowners, you know, get the economic value out of it if they want to do that? Given
Well,
it's hardly in the scheme of things, it's not really that material to meeting our NPS obligations, is it?
The planning rules than it would be a rural residential.
Yeah, the planning rules are quite different for rural compared to rural residential, so it would be a lot harder at the moment.
All right. So what it would do is it would incentivise rural residential. Well, all right. So it depends a bit on your view on that. Okay, Dwayne.
Oh, thank you. One of the things I can see you grappling with a little bit in your conversations is, you know, you might want to preserve it in the long term, but don't want to kind of be eaten up in the meantime. One of the things I guess I'd be concerned as an infrastructure planner is, we've got some pipes we've got to upgrade in the next 10 years, and what does that mean for us? So, I mean, I guess as a practical suggestion, one of the things I might suggest is that while the FDS timeframe is 30 years, I don't think there's anything prohibiting you from signalling that a site might be a future very, very long-term useful for some other land use, for example, this one residential. And if you signalled it in your FDS, then at least when infrastructure planners go to look at the pipe upgrades, they can make a call and say, well, beyond 30 years, this might be a residential site. It's been signalled in the FDS as such. What should we do about our infrastructure in the meantime? And they can make an economic decision then about whether they need to upgrade it at that point, or it's more cost effective to upgrade it in the longer term in another way. But at least they have that information to make that decision, that investment decision. So that was what I was going to suggest.
Great. Okay, thank you. So, Ina, did you have a question, or you some direction?
Oh, no, actually, I keep on forgetting to lower my hand, but
that's all right. It's
the
okay.
more that this conversation is happening and discussed in regards to those three sites, I'm sort of on the lean to sustainable environment and less impact and footprint on human beings on that sustainable environment. So, yes, I agree that for future planning, infrastructure, it is positive to have this in place for future planning direction. But if we can have a balance of the equilibrium of looking after our environment and also developing residential areas, I think that's a positive, sustainable, best way forward for me.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I'm going to, let's start with basically Councillor Mayling and Councillor Eggers. We don't proceed on any of these. That will be the position I'm going to start with. But we pick up Dwayne's comment that we signal this as being an important T28 is an important area for if we don't manage to keep pace with housing supply, the housing with supply, and by that stage we should be all across to electric vehicles. So, not that that's necessarily the be all and end all, or some other form of transport that we don't know about yet, that we might have done that technological shift. So that will be the starting position. Now someone's going to have to, if they want something else, you have to put it on the table.
No, just a quick question of clarification for Councillor Mayling and myself. So by signalling, you just mean in the words and the text? Yep, lovely, thank you.
So we can do that?
I don't think there'll be anything wrong with us indicating that. No, I think that'll be perfectly fine. And as we've discussed before, what this allows is that if we've got landowners who have got sites that are scoring far better in terms of residential, we're going to have to, I almost feel like we need some mechanism that says, well, you've got so long to proceed on that basis, and if you don't, you go to back of the queue for the next 50 years, but I'm not sure there's a mechanism that allows us to do that. All right, David.
Does this include Councillor Bryant's amendment or not?
No, this was, I started from this position. I had two people and I thought who were in agreement.
Well, I don't understand where he's coming from, but if we can put a signal in words, because I just think that the two big sites in Nelson, which are over 4,000 houses, make more sense to me environmentally and for greenhouse gases, and also for infrastructure for the next so many years. I just think that there's a big issue there. That when you look at the whole district, I just think it makes more sense. Carter Valley and Rains, and not at Wakefield.
All right. Okay.
That's where I come from.
All right. Councillor Rieger.
Sorry, just one more question of clarification. Did any submissions come in on T032? And if so, what did they say?
Not specifically. The only submission that came in for T32 was the landowners of T200 wanting to join it. Otherwise, from memory, the submissions that would be relevant were general submissions that were against greenfield development, but people didn't specify if they were against rural residential or against standard greenfield. It was just general greenfield expansion that there was lots of opposition to.
But we did also get some people against rural residential, didn't we?
We did,
Yes.
but again, they've largely been mocked up in. Those answers were put against questions which were general greenfield expansion questions. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Well, can I get a signal whether we've got enough? I'm not expecting to get unanimous sort of thinking all the way through, but have we got a number that would carry this to leaving this heat where it is? Basically, just what these ones don't proceed. That's where you're going. Councillor Rieger, Councillor McGurk. I think I'm on the same view at the moment. So
I agree.
Okay, that's where it is. Done. Okay, well, we'll come back with. Remember, we've got a whole lot more to go, and then we're going to have a bit of a look at what it looks like, and then we may have to come back and do a rethink on some of these. Okay.
I just have a question for Jackie. Jackie, I'm not sure, but we started with Falcon Ridge, but there's quite a number of Tasman ones on the previous page. Are we going to cover them at some stage? On page 56.
So it started at paragraph 20.21, Falcon Ridge. Then we did 20.22, the Pigeon Valley sites that we've just done.
I'm just looking at the list at 20.3.
20.3.
Yeah, okay. I just thought you may have overlooked these TO1.
Okay. We are going to work through them all. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so the next one, I'm at paragraph 20.24. This is the addition to site T17 in Motueka Valley. So T17 was a site that we consulted on. There's two parts to it in the brown there, either side of Mitten Heights. And we have the two sites in blue, 213 and 205, who are landowners who submitted and wanted to join that FDS site. So obviously they scored pretty similarly. There aren't any site-specific attributes that really made them score very differently. Housing capacity, as I've mentioned several times, is heavily constrained in Motueka due to natural hazards and highly productive land. We were actually asked to assess a large number of sites in Motueka Valley. These sites are the closest to Motueka, which is really why we've favoured them, because they are aligning with the preferred spatial scenario. Just in terms of, so basically those landowners at the blue sites own very large land holdings all around them, so there's nobody else to really consider in terms of being immediately affected. Submitters, generally, as we know, haven't been very supportive of rural residential. 13% of submitters agreed with providing greenfield growth in Motueka. A lot of people did acknowledge that there are natural hazard constraints there facing Motueka. So yeah, those sites would be the nearest ones to the town, really, for rural residential.
All right, I'll go to Councillor Rieger. I think the picture that Jackie's painting for us is that the opportunities for development anywhere in Motueka is really constrained. Is that essentially what we're looking at? Okay, and Drew, from memory, just in terms of our transport, does Motueka, it operates as a as a destination? Thank you.
Yeah, through the chair, Motueka does indeed act as a destination. Most of the people, over 70% of the people living and working in Motueka stay within it. When you look at the figure 1 from my amendment, my memo, you'll see that the Mitten Heights area, which this is in, is one of the better rural residential areas that takes into account that a lot of the journeys from this area will be going to Motueka, not to Nelson Richmond. But the distance from this area to Motueka in itself is around 7 kilometres, so it is quite some distance.
All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Sorry, my question involves pointing, which some people won't get to see. So there's T017. Yeah. Is that T017 as well? Okay. That's just confusing, but it does look like 2 sites. Right.
It is 2 sites. It's either side of an existing development. So the bit in between is the Mitten Heights development. The bit in between the 2 parts of T17. That's why it's not contiguous.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, yep, good. I just wanted to clarify. And so then, because you've just got here, they're adjacent and both represent an extension to site T17, the rural residential area. But just to clarify, because it's not ever so specifically stated in here, and that's to extend them to be rural residential as well. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor Ogilvie and then Councillor Mayling.
Yeah, I'm not quite certain about those 2, Jackie. They're very steep. They're about 10k from Motueka, so it's quite a distance from town. In terms of trying to repopulate or Motueka, it's unlikely anyone's going to move there. It's going to be coming somewhere else. You know, for greenhouse gas emissions alone, the yield is quite low. I mean, the yield for 1017 and for 017 is what, 400 plus, isn't it? It's quite high. Adding those 2 doesn't really add much at all, if anything. So that's where I'm coming from in terms of it's not an option for Motueka. It's 10k. 10k is a long way in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, which is a point Drew made this morning.
What's the yield on them?
40, altogether 441, but the other 2 about 20, the most, I'd say, because it's quite steep there.
What's the yield on the other 2 little ones?
They're about 50 dwellings each. The yield on 213 and 205.
Okay.
T17 is about 400. So it's another 100 houses by adding 213 and 205.
I think you struck it in the head.
All right. Ina, any questions on this one?
No questions. I actually visited the site. I'm in favour with TO17. 213 and 205, based on the steepness of the hills, I'd probably just question that one as well. Can we just get confirmation on the potential development of those particular sites, please? Let me just say this. I am in favour of further development in residential home areas for Motueka, absolutely. But however, in regards to site 213 and T205, what are the analyses conducted in that area, please, Jackie, have you done in regards to possibility of infrastructure? What are the infrastructure analyses that you've conducted so far?
So these were all assessed for unserviced rural residential, so wouldn't be providing the 3 waters. That would be down to the individual to provide their own on-site servicing.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other thoughts or questions on these ones, Councillor Mayling?
Well, it's certainly not the flashiest land, but it is some housing near Motueka. And the trouble is, when you look at Motueka, you've got that very highly versatile, highly productive land. And particularly even up in the valley there, I was amazed at how much infrastructure the horticulturalists have put in the last couple of years. And I mean, you're talking $100,000 per hectare when they put in the cloth. So the land on the hills there is not that flash. I think it's the nearest area we've got to Motueka, and we need some more housing there. So, and I think it's 7 k's according to Drew, not quite 10, David, but it is a ways up the valley.
Pretty
But
close
it's
to 10. 205 would be pretty close to 10.
Yeah, but it is certainly a lot closer than the other spots further up. So on the balance, I think I'd leave it in.
I think it's 7, maybe 9 from the Edwards Road corner.
Oh, sorry, I took an average.
Yeah, thanks, Drew.
All right, thank you. Councillor Eager. Oh, there we go. We've got to measure up there. See, here we go. We'll rely on.
There's a crow fly. Yeah, right.
All right, okay. No. Yeah, so just as part of the MCA analysis, just picking up on Councillor Ogilvy's points, you know, is topography considered? And then secondly, it says TO5 ranks 173 and T13 147. Just where's the, I haven't got the sheets on me, but you know, that feels very low in ranking. So firstly,
So yeah, just on that
topography
yeah.
and then the ranking, and you know, because do we have other ones at that ranking that have been excluded because they're too low?
So on the topography, we have a criterion that was called ground conditions, and that considers things like fault hazards, liquefaction risk, and land instability. So all these sites have been assessed by Glenn, who was on the call this morning. He's our hazard scientist, and yes, it's granite, a steep granite, but he was comfortable that a solution can be found. I guess what this shows is that when you try to avoid highly productive land, you end up on this kind of terrain. I mean, that's the trade-off. The other point in terms of the ranking, yeah, they haven't scored particularly well, but they are the closest sites to Motueka that we could find.
All right, thank you. Who's next to my list? Councillor McGurk, and then Ina.
Just taking in Drew's comment about, you know, that a high proportion of people in Motueka stay in Motueka. So what's the yield if those are excluded? What's the projected yield in Motueka with what we've got so far?
I just need to work it out. Sorry, you'll have to just bear with me while I go through some numbers. Oh, actually, it might be quicker to do it on the screen, Maya. Could you click on T190? So T190 is our greenfield intensification site. That is a yield of 600 roughly. Oh, sorry, was that 500? Yeah. That's T190, that's okay. Yes, about 500. And then if you go to the pink one, T89, that should be, or 189. 272, and then the only other site we have in Motueka that's in the draft FDS is the Tefina Marae site, T15, which is for about 30 Papakayanga. So that's all else that we have in Motueka. The other sites have not been recommended for inclusion.
So I think
What's our predicted need?
Well, again, I wouldn't focus too much on that because it's about the overall. We're focused on the overall high-level figure, and I can tell you very certainly that we are not currently meeting demand in Motueka now. So Motueka is our most popular town to live in, according to our housing preferences survey, and it's the place that we provide least zoned land because of all the hazards and highly productive land.
thank you. I'll go to Ina.
Oh, kia ora. So just in regards to TO17 and T20, 213 and T205. So from my own understanding, if you wanted to build up there, you've got to have money and prepare to live off grid. Is that right? Well, you know, in terms of what I see there already are quite comfortable homes, and they are on, they have a view to the coast, so therefore land wouldn't be cheap there. Is that correct?
Not necessarily, actually. I've got a colleague who lives there and has built houses for her children up there very cheaply. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. No.
Okay, and so the town infrastructure, how solid Is that up in that area? And a lot of homes up there, if you want to say sustainable, off the grid?
So we're talking about the T17 area.
Yes.
So there aren't services there at the moment for water or wastewater. So that's all self-serviced.
Self-serviced. Okay. So what I'm trying to leave here is a conversation is, if you want to move up there, you've got to have, you know, basically, it's not affordable to live up there. There's selective lifestyles and incomes, homeowners to live up there and build up there. That's right, isn't there?
I think it depends on the house that you're building up there. As I say, I have a colleague who has built very affordable homes for children up there. So it probably depends on what house you're aspiring to, really.
Okay, well, look, either. I'm very much in support of developing this particular area. It's positive.
All right, thank you, Anna. All right, panel, we've got very limited options here in terms of supply. We can't come down here on this productive land. It's far, far too important. So the question is whether you want to provide some growth capacity near Motueka. I think we have to, righty ho. So I think they're all in, right? Okay, all in. As we discussed yesterday, it is not a one-size-fits-all exercise, this one. What's next, Jackie?
Okay, next is actually a site in Motueka itself, which is T206 Hickmott Place car park. So this one is one that's been proposed through submissions, which is why I didn't mention it before. So it's that one there. It's a council-owned site, currently used as a car park. Actually, I understand mostly used by customers of New World who are adjacent to the site. It's been proposed for apartments, but due to some flood risk issues, the staff considered a proposal of commercial at the ground floor with apartments above, and that would help mitigate some of the flood risk for residential uses. It scored very well, ranking around 14th overall out of all sites assessed. Servicing generally okay. I've got Drew here who might just talk a little bit about the current car parking situation in Motueka, because a couple of the community board members who Councillor Ogilvie asked us to consult did express concerns over the site being developed because of loss of parking, but we'll come back to that in a minute. It's probably important to point out that you could actually build this development now, so it's zone commercial, and under our commercial rules you can actually build residential above a commercial ground floor. The reason we've included it is that the FDS hasn't factored that kind of capacity into our numbers, so it would be an additional capacity for us.
All right, so I'm getting a lot of thumbs up in the chamber here. So I hear we can hear the issues over parking, but I would have to say, isn't that a consent matter that will get addressed at that point? I would have thought. But Drew, is there something, or David, would you particularly like to?
The car parks there.
Is there? Right, okay. Drew?
Yes, so through the chair, yes, there is a significant number of car parks there. Just working on the town centre parking strategy that we adopted in 2018, and looking at those sites and the things that we were trying to achieve out of the parking strategy, there's a couple of things to note. One is that the parking strategy was trying to identify and find places on the western side of High Street, because all of the car parking is on the eastern side of High Street, and including this Hickmott Place. And so we were almost over subscribed on the eastern side, but not on the western side. When we undertake a car parking survey every year, and we do it on the 4th busiest week of the year. And in the situation of Motueka, it's in January, around the highest sort of tourism time. We've got 3 metrics that we test parking against to decide whether it triggers some sort of action. One of them is around restricted parking, the occupancy rates, and we have a level of service around 90% occupancy would trigger, or anything more than 90% would trigger some sort of action. And in our last survey, it was 67% at its peak. we've got a level of service around compliance, and again, it's a 90% compliance, and we had 93% compliance. And then there's another level of service around how far people are walking from residential areas to get to it. That is, they're parking in residential areas in non-restricted parking areas, and we've got a level of service around no more than 10 minutes walk away, and in the last survey it was 3 minutes 30 seconds. So what I'm trying to get at here is that from a parking perspective, we don't have too many concerns around this being converted to some other use. I do note that the parking survey also did look at what that Hickmott Place was used for at that time, and it did confirm what Jackie has just mentioned, that it was mostly people using it for the New World car park, despite New World having its own car park, which was predominantly vacant. And the other point I would make is that there were a number of cars that were parked there all day and using it as part of their all-day parking, but it was a low proportion of the overall use. That's all I've got to add about that.
Any further questions?
Just a question. Oh, sorry.
David? Councillor Ogilvie.
You've got there as mixed development, Jackie. Do we need, I'm quite supportive of this as a residential development only, because commercial, there's no real demand in Motueka for commercial. We've got a commercial area rezoned in 2015 and no movement on that at all. And even currently there are blocks available for sale or for lease. So commercial demand locally seems to be quite low, but residential would be.
So through the mayor, I suppose another option that you could have is just to retain the car parking with apartments above it if you didn't want the commercial ground floor. I mean, that would all be sorted out at the detail stage, I suppose.
All right, so we've got a sense we want this one in. How specific do we want to be about it? We put it in for our, is residential?
I've got a question, please, Madam Mayor, in terms of the potential development for the iwi, for the hapu there, and could they make use of that proposed retail or commercial space underneath the apartment block?
It's out of scope for this, but yes.
I've got it, Susan. Susan? Okay.
There's no reason at all why something like that couldn't happen. Would be out of scope for the FDS, but it is something that there could be discussion between the council and as landowner and local iwi. Yeah. Or
the reason why I'm highlighting this as a question is because David had mentioned that there was already a capacity for retail and commercial space, and this may be a waste of space, even though supportive for a residential apartment block. But however, if we just approve for residential and not approve for the whole potential development of including commercial and residential, that may we're losing opportunity. We may be losing opportunity for that area. Would that be fair to say?
I think the answer is yes. Yes, it would be.
Yes.
Kia ora.
So if we put it as a mixed use, then we leave all the doors open, don't we? Okay, fantastic. That's done. Right, excellent.
Okay, the next one, a small one in Tapawera, 79 Main Road in Tapawera. I'll just let Maya find it on the map, but this is a small site being proposed through submissions, only be about 4 or 5 houses for residential. It's scored well, actually better than the other small site we have in Tapawera. Surrounding landowners have been contacted and 4 out of 5 are supportive. 1 is unsure due to the change in their view, but under the NPSUD amenity is acknowledged as changing over time. We've had support from Te Paewera community during the webinars that they feel that the councils have underestimated the future housing demand. So staff are recommending this site.
I think we've had a good discussion about this one as we've gone through, and it makes good sense to us. So are we all happy for that to go in? Oh, you sorry, Julian.
It's T217.
You missed the flyover.
Hang on.
Yeah, I'm not trying that little green dot over there.
Yes, I think we'll zoom in on that one. No.
Well done, Stu.
There we go. Found it. There we go. Right in the middle there. Perfect. Right. Everyone's happy with that? That one's in. Thank you.
Okay, the next one is St Arnaud, Carreri Top House Road, 3177 Carreri Top House Road. This is the site we've talked about before as well. It adjoins an existing draft FDS site, T181, both proposed for rural residential. It doesn't score quite as well as the adjoining site due to some terrestrial ecology and impact on natural resource, lower scores. But at this stage, we've suggested that both sites could probably be included. They're large sites, and that the boundaries could be redrawn at any rezoning stage to avoid the most important parts of the land, essentially.
Right, thank you, Jackie. That would be one where protecting and enhancing the natural environment is going to be quite important to
That's
how
right,
it's
yeah.
developed. So that's going to be a good discussion with the ecologists as they work through it. Councillor Eager?
Yeah, I must admit, I was a bit concerned about the commentary in the report when it mentions terrestrial ecology, biodiversity, and impact on life-sustaining quality of natural resources and ecosystems, and that it sort of only scored better when putting the two together. You know, I hear that this can be managed at a consent stage, but I just, you know, were there elements, were there areas within that site that were, you know, worse than others in that regard, so that we actually don't include all of T19? Is there different overlays we can have, you know, to protect areas? So I'm not sure exactly what the problem is. But so, for example, you know, if there was a wetland, you could exclude the wetland area. So, you know, is there some other treatment that can be done or signalled up at this stage?
So just to be clear, they were assessed separately, so we haven't combined them to create a better score. What we're saying is that one score is better than the other. But the terrestrial ecology is related to wetlands. I'm just trying to find the notes, just bear with me. Yeah, there are. But it was felt that due to the size of the sites, there's also a fault line that runs through the sites. But because the sites are so large and the landowners are only proposing part development of the sites, it's felt that for further evaluation at any rezoning stage, you would avoid those parts of the sites. So we're not really trying to draw detailed boundaries at the moment. Yeah.
So is that then something that can be addressed through text in the FDS?
Yeah, I think it should be. Yeah,
that would give me some comfort,
because we wouldn't want all, you know, both of those whole sites to be developed. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think we maybe need to, you know, explain the sites a little bit through text, and that would probably give me some comfort. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McGurk.
I actually wonder why this is even being included. You know, I think was that because it was put up by a landowner. Was the existing site already been zoned or designated for future development?
So T181 came about through a landowner suggestion last year. The reason we've considered adding 219, which has come through submissions, is that St Arnaud itself is another very difficult town to find any suitable sites in because of natural hazards. We have heard from the landowner of 181 at the hearings that the school role is struggling. And we had heard at the webinars for St Arnaud that they felt they need more young people in the town to make it a more sustainable community. It has an ageing demographic. So there does seem to be a need for further housing in St Arnaud, and it's a very difficult place to find new sites. So we've ended up coming out of the town, really.
You said it was the submission. Submission was,
Yeah.
thank you, Councillor Bryan, just around permanent residents, permanent places, rather than holiday homes.
Yeah, that's what
All right, thoughts on this one? Councillor Mailing?
Just the holiday homes tend to be grouped around the edge of the national park and right near the lake. And that's the issue, where there's other people, and we've got a Papakayanga type one to come up after this one, I think. So we do need some sites up there, and it is very difficult. And there is issues with wetlands as well, isn't there, Stu, in certain parts of it?
All right, so need to get just a bit of a steer as to whether we're prepared to keep this one in at this point. Councillor Bryant, happy with that? Yes. Yes, feeling nods in here. I know, are you happy with this one's remaining in? These two?
I am happy, but with information attached in terms of proving the mitigating the adverse effects to the environment.
Right, I think we need to be noting that, and that might be one we want to come back to tomorrow, just in terms of, because we really need to be improving our environmental outcomes through what we're doing. That was one of our principles that we're operating to, or was it objectives? I forget what it is. One of our objectives. Okay, next up.
Okay, so that's all the new sites. Now we're just on to the amended sites. So the first one of those is T1, Jeffreys Road in Brightwater. There's actually two. Well, we'll just deal with one amendment for now because we're dealing with some of the changes under a different theme. So just that blue area that Maya is circling there, the landowner wanted all of his land to be included rather than part of it. It had originally been drawn, the boundary had been originally drawn a few years ago, cutting through his land to leave his own property effectively not affected by development, but he's seen the plans and would rather that the whole thing's included. So that's the small extension to T1.
Everyone happy with that one? Yes.
Makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay, the next one is in Fairfax Street.
Sorry, Jackie. Let's go to Councillor Riga.
Sorry, I did send through a question about the next quite a few that you're about to raise, T37, T195, T42, T107 and T05, where in the report it mentions the growth plan change, but it doesn't actually mention submissions. So before we get to them, can you confirm that we have had submissions? Because I don't know what the growth plan change is, and that's not part of this process. So are these all in response to submissions?
Yes, indirectly, yeah, but not submissions on the FDS. So what happened was the growth plan change was running alongside the FDS, and engagement occurred on that concurrently with the FDS. So the staff were at the webinars with us. All those sites that you referred to coming up, they were all originally 2019 FDS sites, which are now being proposed for rezoning as the process goes. Due to further evaluation of those sites, there have been some minor changes to the boundaries of those sites. They've been consulted on through the first round of engagement for the growth plan change, and I have the feedback from that.
Okay, so through you, Madam Mayor, I'm not really comfortable and would seek clarification on this process. I would have believed, sorry, but Nelson has not, this is a growth future development strategy. Nelson has not been part of any growth plan change. And I would have thought that submissions to a separate process cannot be included as a submission to this. So I need some clarification on this because I'm not really comfortable. We'll go to Susan.
So my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jackie, is that the main sites were proposed in our proposal, so they were in the FDS. And we've had some submissions that that have come in as well. It's really a staff submission, isn't it? That some of these sites be amended and tweak the boundaries of as a result of submissions through the plan change process. So it's not adding in whole new sites that were there before, and all we're doing is just making minor amendments to the boundaries of them.
Okay, if I can just seek further clarification on that though. So I guess my question is that in essence, where is the staff submission? Because shouldn't the staff submission be separate to the reporting officer's report? Shouldn't they be two separate things? Whereas I haven't seen a submission from staff about that.
If I can maybe just add a comment, that the only reason for making these amendments is that if we didn't, our capacity estimates would be unrealistic, because the original boundary of the site that we had in the draft FDS has changed slightly because colleagues have done further work for the growth plan change. So all we're trying to do is make sure that they align and that those capacities are realistic, basically. But it's not a staff submission. I think we're able to make changes to the draft FDS sites, provided we feel that we are informed by the community's views on those changes. And we are informed by those because the growth plan change has been consulted on. So
I think I can see what we've got to. I think just maybe go and reflect on what Councillor Eager is raising, is that we're conflating two processes here. Now, that's not necessarily, but you're going to have to find a way that you can introduce this material, or essentially, Jackie, what you're trying to do is make this more accurate, I take it, that it would be inaccurate if we didn't make the change. So
yeah, I mean, we could leave the sites as they were, but it wouldn't be accurate.
All right, so you're just going to need to have a think about how you approach that in terms of what we're doing here. I don't think anyone's disagreeing with what you're proposing. We just need to make sure we've got a mechanism to do that. I know, I'll come to you on the screen.
Okay, Madam Chair, I'm just going to ask a question in regards to the legal advice on citizen aggression in regards to the FDC.
Well, we won't do that just now because we're in public. So if I want to do that, I'll have to move into confidential.
Okay.
Is that what I can do? Would you like to, if you want to ask that question, that's what I'll do now.
Yes, please.
Okay, no problem. I'll move, we go into confidential purposes of discussing legal advice, seconded by Councillor Eager. I'll put that motion. All those in favour? Aye. Against, and that's carried. We'll just pause now while we do the technology to take us into confidential. It'll just take a few moments, Ina, and I'll let you know when we've done.
While that's happening, man.
Well, Jackie, just to stop here. I'm just going to put it on. Yep. Thank you. Ina, would you be happy to close with karakia in a moment, just so that we can all stay connected in our hui, even though, thank you. So just letting the public back in, we just had to go into confidential to discuss legal advice, and we have done that. We're now back in public session. We've had a good productive day. It's going to take us some time to work through the sites, and we've still got quite a few more topics to go, but we'll be back again tomorrow. I do have a full day set aside with a couple of things I need to pop out to do in the afternoon. Councillor McGurk, you will be an apology for the afternoon.
Probably need to finish around about 11ish.
11, okay. And so I really do want to try and get the key decisions, direction from those key decisions. Well, Councillor McGurk is here, even if we're not going to be able to do the final decision if we happen to get to that point. Councillor Ogilvie.
Can we have the Tasman community one early tomorrow morning, please?
Yes, we definitely will have that early tomorrow morning. All right, so we'll make sure that one's, because that's quite fundamental, isn't it, to our decision making. So we need to have that one through as well. I'm just having a look at my diary. Yes, so we'll have to pop out briefly later in the day. But let's see how we go. From an officer perspective, you know what you've still got to present. How do you think we're going? Do we need to pick the pace up a bit tomorrow morning?
Yeah, I think we've got through most of the new and amended sites, subject to those growth plan change ones. I think it would be good, as you say, to do the deliberations on those key matters that we did yesterday.
Yes. Once we've done the sites,
and then we've got to do site-specific matters tomorrow as well. Well, that's not as big as what we've just done. So I think we're probably okay.
All right, good. Okay. All right, we'll get the Tasman village one out of the way early on in the morning. We'll get the front end recommendations sorted as well, finish these sites, and then we'll see how we're going for progressing the last parts of this. Thank you everyone for another big day and juggling multiple tasks, and good luck with your inboxes. If yours looks anything like mine, you're going to have a lot of work to do once you finish the rest of your afternoon meeting. So thank you to everyone, and I know it's been a real pleasure having you part of our hearing today, and just so that we stay connected, I'll ask you to close with karakia.
Kia ora tātou, karaki tātou. E tō mātou mātou te rangi kia tapiroa kua tau mātou rangi te tāngka me tai ai kērens whenau ki re tuano ki tō te rangi. Ho mai ke mātou nāna he tarama mātou mai tēnei rā. Miri o mātou hara me mātou hoki mene nei. I o taharana ki a mātou, hau i mātou i oi kawa i whakawaia. I ngari whaki o ringa mātou i te keno nau te rangi te tangata kaha me te kororea. Ake, ake, ake. Āmene.
Āmene. Kia ora.
Kia ora, ka kite a popo.
Ka kite ana.